You want a wife, or just another winter alone? The question hit Jonah Briggs like a slap across the face, cutting through years of carefully built walls. He'd turned down every woman in Sage Hollow, widows, debutantes, even the preacher's daughter. But when Clara Monroe stood in his blacksmith shop with those unflinching eyes, something cracked inside him. This is the story of a cowboy who chose silence over heartbreak, until one woman's words made him realize some truths hurt worse than loneliness. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The December wind howled through Sage Hollow like a wounded animal, rattling the wooden signs that hung crooked above the storefronts and sending dried tumbleweeds skittering down Main Street like lost souls searching for shelter. The town huddled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, small and stubborn. The kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, and gossip traveled faster than telegrams. Jonah Briggs didn't give them much to talk about anymore. He kept to himself in the old blacksmith shop at the edge of town, the one his father had built with his own hands 30 years prior. The forge glowed red even in the coldest months, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil had become as familiar to the townsfolk as the church bells, though those rang far less frequently these days, ever since Reverend Hutchins had taken ill. At 32, Jonah was what the women called handsome in a hard way. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that always needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds, he moved through the world with the deliberate care of a man who'd learned young that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. His face bore the kind of weathered lines that came from squinting into the sun and grinding your teeth through pain you didn't want to name. The women of Sage Hollow had tried, God knows they'd tried. First, there'd been Margaret Wilson, the widow whose husband had died in a mining accident 2 years back. She'd brought him apple pie, still warm, she'd made sure to mention, and stood in his shop with hope bright in her eyes. A man needs more than his own cooking, she'd said, her voice soft as summer rain. Jonah had thanked her kindly, taken the pie, and told her plain as day he wasn't looking for company. Then came Sarah Beth Porter, all 23 years of her fresh-faced and eager, daughter of the town's wealthiest merchant. She'd commissioned a wrought iron fence for her father's property and found excuses to visit the shop 3 times a week, always dressed in her finest, always smelling of rosewater and ambition. "Mr. Briggs," she'd said one afternoon, twirling her parasol with practiced charm, "Father says you're the finest craftsman in 3 counties. A man with such skill could build quite a life for himself. For a family." He'd finished her fence 2 weeks early and hadn't charged her father a penny more than the initial quote. The visits stopped. There'd been others. Mary Catherine from the general store, who laughed too loud and touched his arm too often. The schoolteacher before Clara, Miss Peterson, who'd quoted poetry at him until he'd felt trapped between the verses. Even Dolores from the saloon, who was honest about what she wanted and didn't dress it up in pretty words, though her offer was the same: companionship, warmth, a shared life. Jonah had refused them all. "That Briggs boy's got a heart made of iron, same as what he forges," old Timothy Crane liked to say, sitting outside the mercantile with the other retired ranchers, whittling and judging in equal measure. "Ain't natural for a man his age to be so set against female company. Maybe he prefers his horse," someone would always joke, and they'd laugh. But underneath the humor ran a current of genuine bewilderment. In a town where survival often meant partnership, where winters were harsh and life was harder, Jonah's solitude seemed not just unusual, but almost offensive. What they didn't know, what Jonah never spoke of, was Rebecca. Rebecca Hayes, with her honey-colored hair and promises that had tasted sweeter than any pie Margaret Wilson could bake. They'd been engaged 5 years ago, planned a wedding for the spring, talked about the children they'd have and the life they'd build. Jonah had started adding a room onto his cabin, working by lamplight after long days at the forge, imagining her in the kitchen, in the garden, in his arms. Then Thomas Whitmore rode into town. Thomas, with his inherited ranch and easy smile and pockets deep enough to promise Rebecca things Jonah never could. Fine dresses from San Francisco, a house with real glass windows, trips to Denver whenever she pleased. Jonah had seen the change in her eyes before she'd spoken the words, watched the future he'd built in his mind crumble like ash from the forge. "You have to understand, Jonah," she'd said, Standing in the very shop where he now worked alone, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. Thomas can give me security, a real life. You're a good man, but good doesn't pay for much in this world. He'd let her go without a fight. What was the point? She'd shown him the truth, stripped away the pretty lies about love being enough. Money talked louder than promises, and trust was just another word for the space where disappointment grew. After Rebecca, Jonah had built walls higher than the mountain peaks that ringed the valley. He was polite but distant, friendly but unreachable. He did his work, kept his word, paid his debts, and expected nothing from anyone that couldn't be written in a contract or settled with a handshake. The loneliness was a fair trade for certainty. Or so he'd told himself right up until the day Clara Monroe walked into his shop. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early December, the kind of day where the cold bit through wool and leather like it had teeth. Jonah was working on a commission for the Hendersons, a decorative gate with their family initials worked into the scrollwork. Detailed work, the kind that required concentration, which was why he didn't hear her come in at first. "Mr. Briggs?" The voice cut through the hammer's ring, clear and direct, with none of the affected sweetness he'd learned to recognize as prelude to unwanted attention. He looked up, squinting through the forge light and the dimness of the shop beyond it. She stood just inside the doorway, framed by the weak winter sun, and for a moment Jonah's hammer paused mid-swing. Clara Monroe was not beautiful in the conventional way that Sarah Beth Porter was beautiful, all porcelain skin and delicate features. Clara's beauty was something fiercer, more elemental. She had dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, high cheekbones that suggested some Cherokee heritage, and eyes the color of aged whiskey, golden brown with flecks of green that caught the light. She wore a simple wool dress the color of charcoal, and a coat that had seen better years but was clean and well mended. But it was her expression that arrested him. She looked at him with absolute directness, no coy glances or manufactured shyness. She studied him the way he might study a piece of metal, assessing its properties, its strengths, its potential weak points. "Yes, ma'am?" He set the hammer down, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "I'm Clara Monroe, the new school teacher. I need a lock for the schoolhouse door. The current one's rusted through." Straight to business, no preamble, no small talk about the weather or compliments about his work. Jonah found it oddly refreshing. "I can manage that. When do you need it by?" "End of the week, if possible. The children have been getting in after hours, rearranging things. Nothing malicious, just mischief, but I'd prefer to secure the supplies." He nodded, pulling out his ledger to write down the details. "I'll need to come by, take measurements, see what kind of fixture you're working with. Tomorrow morning, before school starts? Say 7 o'clock? That'll work." She should have left then. The transaction was complete, the arrangement made. But Clara Monroe didn't move. Instead, she stepped further into the shop, her gaze traveling over the various pieces in progress. Horseshoes waiting to be fitted, an iron chandelier destined for the hotel in the next town over, and the Henderson gate with its intricate scrollwork. "You do beautiful work," she said, and there was genuine appreciation in her voice, not flattery. "I saw the stair railing you made for the Carlsons, the way you incorporated those vine patterns. It's art, not just craft." Despite himself, Jonah felt a small flicker of pride. He took his work seriously, always had, pushing himself to improve, to create pieces that would outlast him. Most people just saw function. A horseshoe held a horse, a gate kept things in or out. Few recognized the artistry that could live in practical things. "Thank you, ma'am." "Clara," she corrected. "We're going to be neighbors of a sort. I'm renting the room above the dress shop just down the street. Seems foolish to stand on formality." "Jonah, then." Another silence, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. Clara continued her examination of the shop with the air of someone genuinely interested, not someone biding time to work up to something else. She paused at his workbench where he kept his sketches, rough drawings of pieces he was planning, ideas that came to him in the quiet hours. "May I?" She gestured to the papers. He hesitated, then nodded. Those drawings felt private somehow, glimpses into the part of his mind that still dreamed, still created. But there was something about Clara Monroe that made him want to show her, to see what she'd make of them. She lifted the top sheet carefully, studying a design for a weather vane shaped like a running horse, all flowing lines and implied motion. Her fingers traced the pencil marks, and Jonah found himself watching her face, trying to read her reaction. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "Have you made it yet?" "No, just an idea." "You should. The world needs more beautiful things, especially out here, where everything's so—" She paused, searching for the word. "Severe." She set the drawing down with care and turned to face him fully. In the forge light, her eyes seemed to glow with their own warmth, and Jonah felt something shift in his chest, some long-dormant awareness stirring to life. "I should let you work," Clara said. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. "I'll be there." She was halfway to the door when she paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Jonah?" "Yes?" "The women in this town talk. They say you've refused every offer, turned down every kindness that came with strings attached." Her expression was unreadable. "I just want you to know, I'm not here to add to that list. I need a lock, and you're the blacksmith. That's all this is." There was something almost like challenge in her voice, as if she was daring him to assume otherwise, to project onto her the same expectations he'd faced from others. "Understood," he said, though he felt oddly disappointed, which made no sense at all. Clara nodded and left, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft bang that seemed louder than it should in the sudden emptiness of the shop. Jonah stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, aware of a strange restlessness building under his skin. Then he shook his head, dismissing the feeling, and returned to his work. The Henderson gate wasn't going to finish itself, and he had a lock to forge for a school teacher who wanted nothing from him but his skill. That should have been a relief. So why did it feel like the opposite? The next morning dawned sharp and clear, the kind of cold that turned your breath to crystal in the air. Jonah arrived at the schoolhouse at precisely 7 o'clock, toolbox in hand, to find Clara already there, sweeping the front steps with brisk, efficient movements. "Punctual," she observed, leaning the broom against the railing. "I appreciate that. My father used to say a man's word is only as good as his ability to keep it. That includes being where you say you'll be, when you say you'll be there." Something flickered across Clara's face, approval, maybe, or recognition. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Jonah climbed the steps, not elaborating. The past was the past, and talking about it wouldn't bring anyone back. The schoolhouse was a simple structure, one large room with a pot-bellied stove in the corner and rows of desks that had seen decades of use. The walls were decorated with children's drawings and a map of the United States that was already outdated. It didn't include the newest territories. Books lined shelves at the back, and a chalkboard dominated the front wall, already marked with tomorrow's lessons in Clara's neat handwriting. The current lock was, as she'd said, rusted beyond repair. Jonah examined it, noting the type of fixture, the measurements he'd need. Clara watched him work, not hovering but present, and he found himself acutely aware of her proximity. "How long have you been teaching?" he asked, partly to fill the silence, partly because he was genuinely curious. 6 years, started in a one-room school in Kansas, then worked my way west. This is my third post." "You move around a lot." "I go where I'm needed, small towns mostly, places that have trouble keeping teachers because the pay's low and the conditions are hard." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity or pride. "I like the challenge, and I like knowing that what I do matters, even if it's just teaching farm children their letters and numbers." Jonah made a few more measurements, jotting them down in his notebook. "What brought you to Sage Hollow specifically?" "The previous teacher, Miss Peterson, left rather suddenly to get married. The town needed someone before winter set in too deep, and I was finishing up a contract in Wyoming. The timing worked." She paused. "Though I gather Miss Peterson had other interests here, beyond teaching." There was the slightest emphasis on other interests, and Jonah felt his jaw tighten. Of course Clara would have heard the stories. In a town this size, everyone knew everything. "Miss Peterson had romantic notions," he said carefully, standing and brushing dust from his knees. "They didn't include me." "Actually," Clara said, her tone dry as summer dust, "I heard it was quite the opposite. That you shut down her recitations of Wordsworth with the efficiency of a man closing a barn door against a storm." Despite himself, Jonah felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Wordsworth has his place, just not in my blacksmith shop at 6 in the morning. Clara laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the dim schoolhouse. Fair enough. I'll make note. No poetry before breakfast. No poetry at all would be preferable. What about stories? Do you object to those as well, or just verse? Stories are fine. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. They go somewhere. Unlike poetry, which just circles around feelings without landing anywhere useful. Clara's eyes glinted with amusement. That's a practical man's view if I ever heard one. I'm a practical man. Comes with the profession. Does it? Clara moved to the window, looking out at the street where a few early risers were beginning their day. I think you can be a craftsman and still have room for impractical things. Dreams, for instance. Or beauty for its own sake, not just beauty in service of function. Jonah thought of the weather-vane sketch, still sitting on his workbench, never quite making it from paper to iron. Maybe. That's not a no, Clara observed. It's not a yes either. She turned to face him, and there was that direct gaze again, the one that felt like it could see past all his carefully maintained defenses. You know what I think, Jonah Briggs? I suspect you're going to tell me whether I want to know or not. I think you're afraid of impractical things because they're harder to control. Iron bends to your will if you heat it right, hit it right, shape it right. But feelings, dreams, people, they don't follow the same rules, can't be forced or fixed with the right technique. The observation hit closer to home than Jonah liked. He closed his toolbox with more force than necessary, the latches clicking shut like punctuation marks, ending the conversation. I'll have the lock ready by Friday, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I'll install it myself, make sure it fits proper. Clara didn't look offended by his retreat into professionalism. If anything, she looked understanding, which somehow felt worse, like she'd diagnosed him and found him wanting, but was too kind to say it outright. Friday works, thank you, Jonah. He nodded and left, stepping out into the cold morning air that felt like a relief after the close warmth of the schoolhouse. As he walked back to his shop, toolbox swinging at his side, he tried to shake off the unsettled feeling that had taken root in his chest. Clara Monroe was dangerous, he decided. Not in the way the other women had been, with their obvious designs and transparent hopes. No, Clara was dangerous precisely because she seemed to want nothing from him, which meant he had no defense prepared, no walls built against the specific shape of her presence in his life. He'd make the lock, install it, and keep his distance. That was the smart play, the safe play. But for the first time in years, safety felt less like protection and more like prison. The week passed in its usual rhythm. Jonah worked the forge, filling orders and perfecting pieces. The Henderson gate was completed and delivered to appreciative exclamations about the craftsmanship. A rancher from 2 towns over commissioned a set of specialized tools. Life moved forward in its predictable way. Except it didn't feel predictable anymore. Jonah found his thoughts drifting to the schoolhouse at odd moments, while hammering out a horseshoe, while banking the forge fire at night, while lying in his narrow bed and listening to the wind test the shutters. He thought about Clara's observation, about being afraid of things he couldn't control. He thought about her laugh, bright and unguarded, so different from Rebecca's calculated charm. He told himself it meant nothing. She was new in town, a novelty. The interest would fade. But when Friday came and he carried the finished lock to the schoolhouse, his heart was beating faster than the walk warranted. Clara was dismissing the children when he arrived, a chaotic exodus of young voices and running feet, scarves trailing and lunch pails clanging. She stood on the steps like a lighthouse in a storm of childhood energy, calling out reminders about homework and warnings to walk carefully on the icy patches. And Tommy Henderson, she called to a boy of about 10 who was already halfway down the street, you tell your mother I need to speak with her about your arithmetic. Yes, Miss Monroe, the boy yelled back, not slowing down at all. Clara sighed, shaking her head, but she was smiling. When the last child had rounded the corner and relative quiet descended, she noticed Jonah waiting by the gate. Perfect timing, she said, gesturing him up. Come in, let's see what you've made. The lock was one of his better pieces, solid, reliable, with a mechanism that would last decades if properly maintained. He'd even added a small decorative element, a scrollwork pattern around the keyhole that echoed the designs he'd seen in Clara's classroom, the vine-like drawings the children had made. Clara took it from him, turning it over in her hands, and her expression softened. You added decoration. Seemed fitting for a schoolhouse. It's beautiful, Jonah. More than I expected. I do the work right, or I don't do it at all. He installed it efficiently, the new lock fitting perfectly into the old door. He demonstrated how it worked, handed Clara the key. He'd made two, kept on the same ring, and stepped back to admire the fit. That should keep your mischief makers out, he said. Should, but won't, Clara replied, pocketing the keys. Children are remarkably creative when they want to be, but it'll slow them down at least. She paused. What do I owe you? Jonah named a price that was fair but not inflated. Clara nodded and went to her desk, retrieving a small leather purse from the drawer. She counted out the coins with the same precision she probably used when grading papers, and handed them over. Thank you, she said. It's good work, as promised. This was it. Transaction complete. Business concluded. Jonah should leave, return to his shop. Let this be the end of his interaction with Clara Monroe beyond the polite nods they'd exchange on the street. But his feet didn't move toward the door. Can I ask you something? The words came out before he'd fully decided to speak them. Clara looked surprised, but not unwelcoming. Of course. Why teaching? You're clearly educated, probably had other options. Why this? He gestured around the simple schoolhouse. Instead of something easier? Clara was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. She moved to one of the student desks and sat down, looking almost childlike in the too small seat, and gestured for Jonah to sit as well. He took the desk beside her, feeling ridiculous with his knees nearly hitting his chin, and waited. My mother died when I was young, Clara began, her voice steady but soft. My father worked on the railroad, gone for weeks at a time. There was a teacher in our town, Mrs. Brennan, who took me in after school hours, fed me dinner, helped me with my lessons, taught me that education was a door that nobody could close once you'd walked through it. She looked at her hands, folded on the scarred desktop. Mrs. Brennan died when I was 15, cholera epidemic, and I realized that what she'd given me, not just knowledge, but hope, a future, a sense that I mattered, that was worth more than any paying profession I might find in a city. So I became a teacher. Because somewhere out there, there's always a child who needs someone to see them, to believe in them, to give them that door. Jonah felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd worn for so long. Here was someone who'd faced loss, who understood that the world could take everything from you, and instead of closing off, she'd chosen to give. It was the opposite of his own response to heartbreak, and it shamed him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He searched for words. That's good. What you do. It matters. So does what you do, Clara said, meeting his eyes. You create things that last, things that serve people long after you're gone. There's honor in that, Jonah, even if you can't see it yourself. The late afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In that light, Clara looked almost otherworldly, and Jonah felt the danger of her presence more acutely than ever. I should go, he said, standing abruptly, the desk scraping against the floor. Let you close up. Clara stood as well, walking him to the door. As Jonah stepped out into the cold, she called after him. Jonah? He turned, one hand on the gate. You're welcome here. Any time. If you ever want to, talk, or just sit quietly. Sometimes the forge must get lonely. It was an offer of friendship, nothing more. Simple, honest, with no hidden agenda. And yet it terrified him more than any declaration of romantic interest ever had. I'll keep that in mind, he managed, and fled like a man escaping a burning building. But as he walked back through the gathering dusk, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something important behind in that schoolhouse, something he might desperately need, even if he was too stubborn or too scared to admit it. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that Jonah tried to convince himself was normal. He'd see Clara around town, at the general store, at Sunday service when he bothered to attend, on the street as she walked to and from the schoolhouse. They'd exchange pleasantries, brief conversations that never went deeper than weather and work. But the town had noticed. "Saw you talking to the new school teacher again," Harold Peterson mentioned one morning, bringing his plow blade in for sharpening. "Twice in 1 week. That must be some kind of record for you, Briggs." Jonah kept his eyes on the grindstone, sparks flying. "She needed a lock. I provided one. Not much else to say about it." "Mm-hmm." Harold's skepticism was palpable. "My wife says Miss Monroe's different from the others. Says she's got sense, that one. Not trying to trap a husband like some kind of, well, like some do." "Your wife's right. Clara's just doing her job, same as me." "Clara, is it?" Harold's grin was infuriating. "First names already. That's progress." Jonah shut down the grindstone, the sudden silence pointed. "Your blade's done. That'll be 50 cents. Harold paid and left, chuckling to himself, and Jonah tried to return to work. But the conversation needled at him. Was that what people thought? That he was courting Clara Monroe? The idea was absurd. He'd barely spoken to her beyond those few encounters, had kept his distance exactly as he'd planned. Except that wasn't entirely true, was it? There was the afternoon he'd spotted her struggling with a heavy crate of books outside the schoolhouse and had crossed the street without thinking to help carry them inside. The Sunday when he'd saved her a seat in church because the service was unusually crowded and she'd arrived late. The time he'd mentioned to Harold Peterson's wife that Clara might appreciate some of those preserves she was famous for, since teaching left little time for cooking. And wasn't it something how the schoolhouse got so cold in the mornings? Small things, insignificant things, things that added up to something he wasn't ready to name. December deepened toward Christmas, and Sage Hollow transformed. Evergreen wreaths appeared on doors, candles glowed in windows, and the general store displayed hard candies and ribbon in festive colors. The town was planning its annual Christmas Eve gathering in the church hall, a potluck affair where everyone contributed what they could and pretended, for one night at least, that life wasn't so hard. Jonah usually skipped it. Crowds weren't his preference, and enforced merriment even less so. But this year, he found himself reconsidering. It was Clara who changed his mind, though she didn't know it. He'd been working late one evening, absorbed in a commissioned piece, when he heard carols singing in the distance. The school children, he realized, practicing for the Christmas Eve service. On impulse, he set down his tools and walked toward the sound. The church doors stood open, light and music spilling out into the dark. Jonah lingered in the shadows outside, watching through the doorway as Clara conducted the children with patient enthusiasm. They were murdering Silent Night, voices off-key, rhythm non-existent, but Clara didn't seem to mind. She encouraged them, corrected gently, and when they finally made it through one complete verse in something resembling harmony, she clapped as if they'd performed at Carnegie Hall. "Beautiful," she exclaimed. "You're going to make Christmas Eve something special. Now, one more time, and remember, Round Yon Virgin isn't a race. Take your time with those words." The children giggled and launched into another attempt, marginally better than the last. And Clara was radiant. Joy seemed to emanate from her like heat from a forge, and Jonah felt drawn to it despite himself. He must have made some sound, some shift in the shadows, because Clara's head turned toward the door. Her eyes found him in the darkness, and her expression shifted. Surprise, then something warmer. She held up one finger to the children. "Keep singing, exactly like that," and walked to the door. "Jonah," she said, stepping outside and pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Heard the singing. Came to investigate." "And what's your assessment? Are we ready for Christmas Eve?" "They're enthusiastic," Clara laughed. That bright sound he'd come to recognize, to listen for without meaning to. Enthusiasm counts for a lot. Pitch can be taught, but you can't teach caring. She tilted her head, studying him. "Will you come? To the Christmas Eve service and the gathering after?" "I don't usually." "I know. You don't usually attend. You don't usually engage. You don't usually do a lot of things." There was no judgment in her voice, just observation. "But maybe this year could be different. Maybe you could let it be different." From inside the church, the children's voices rose in triumphant, if imperfect, harmony. The sound drifted out into the winter night, carrying with it the promise of something Jonah had forgotten he could want: belonging, community, connection. "I'll think about it," he heard himself say. Clara smiled, and it felt like victory and challenge all at once. "Good. That's all I ask. Thinking about it is a start." She went back inside, and Jonah stood in the cold a moment longer, listening to the carols and wondering what the hell he was doing. This was how it started, wasn't it? This was how walls came down and hearts got broken. First you make exceptions, then you make excuses. And before you know it, you're building additions onto your cabin for a woman who'll leave the moment something better comes along. He should walk away. Go back to his shop, his solitude, his safety. But even as he thought it, even as he turned and headed back through the dark streets, Jonah knew the truth. It was already too late. Clara Monroe had gotten under his skin, into his thoughts, past his defenses without even trying. And the terrifying part was that he wasn't sure he wanted to stop her anymore. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow, the kind that made everything look clean and new, like the world had been given a chance to start over. Jonah stood in his cabin, looking at his reflection in the small mirror by the washstand, and tried to remember the last time he'd cared what he looked like. He'd shaved, put on his better shirt, the one without any fraying at the collar, and even attempted to tame his hair with water and force of will. The result was adequate. He looked like a man making an effort, which was probably more telling than he wanted it to be. The church service was scheduled for 7, the gathering to follow immediately after. Jonah had baked bread, his mother's recipe, one of the few things he could make that wouldn't embarrass him in a potluck setting. It sat wrapped in cloth on his table, and he stared at it like it might explain what he was doing, why he was breaking years of self-imposed isolation for a Christmas Eve service. But he knew why. Clara. Everything came back to Clara. Had been coming back to Clara since the moment she'd walked into his shop with her direct gaze and her lack of pretense. She'd asked him a question he couldn't answer, had seen something in him he'd thought was buried too deep to find. And now here he was, shaved, presentable, carrying bread to a church gathering like a man who belonged to something beyond himself. The church was already full when he arrived, warm with body heat and candlelight, smelling of pine boughs and the mixed aromas of a dozen different dishes. Families clustered together, children squirmed in their Sunday best, and conversation hummed like a living thing. Jonah nearly turned around. Then he saw Clara. She stood near the front talking with Mrs. Henderson and a few other women, animated in her description of something. She wore a deep green dress he hadn't seen before, simple but elegant, and her hair was down for once, falling in waves past her shoulders. The candlelight caught the auburn highlights, turning them to copper and flame. As if sensing his presence, she looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded church, and her face transformed with a smile so genuine, so warm, that Jonah felt it like a physical thing, a hand reaching out, pulling him forward, refusing to let him retreat. She excused herself from the other women and made her way to him, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice, relief, maybe, or happiness. "I wasn't sure you would. I brought bread." He held it up like evidence, like proof he belonged here. "Then you're officially part of the feast. Come on, we'll add it to the table." She took his arm, her hand light on his sleeve, and guided him through the crowd. People greeted him, some with surprise, others with barely concealed speculation, but Clara's presence at his side seemed to smooth the way, to make his attendance unremarkable instead of noteworthy. The potluck table groaned with food, roasted chickens and ham, potatoes fixed 6 different ways, vegetables preserved from summer gardens, pies and cakes and cookies in abundance. Clara added his bread to the collection, arranging it on a platter with care. "Your mother's recipe?" she asked. "How did you know?" "Because it's wrapped the way someone who loved you would have taught you to wrap it. Careful. Proper." She met his eyes. "Am I right?" Jonah nodded, not trusting his voice. The way Clara saw things, understood things without being told, it was unsettling and comforting in equal measure. The service began shortly after, Reverend Hutchins leading them through familiar hymns and readings. The children's choir performed their carols, and while they weren't perfect, they were exactly as Clara had promised, enthusiastic and full of care. Jonah found himself watching Clara more than the children, seeing the pride in her face, the way she mouthed the words along with them, encouraging them with every breath. When the children reached the final verse of Silent Night, something unexpected happened. The church fell genuinely silent, everyone holding their breath as the young voices rose in surprising harmony. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. The words hung in the air, pure and clear, and Jonah felt something shift in his chest, a loosening, a softening, like iron heated just enough to become malleable. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, these people he'd kept at arm's length for years, and saw not judgment or expectation, but simply community. Imperfect, complicated, human community. And when the song ended and the church erupted in applause, when Clara caught his eye and grinned with shared triumph, Jonah realized he was smiling too. Really smiling, not the tight-lipped acknowledgement he usually offered, but a genuine expression of joy. It felt strange. It felt wonderful. It felt dangerous as hell. The gathering afterward was chaos in the best way. Plates being filled, children running between adults' legs, conversations overlapping in a pleasant din. Jonah found himself drawn into discussions he'd normally avoid, answering questions about his work, even laughing at Harold Peterson's terrible jokes. But he was always aware of where Clara was, his attention tracking her movements through the room like a compass finding north. She floated from group to group, making sure the shy children were included, drawing out the quieter adults, creating connections with the ease of someone who understood that loneliness was a choice no one should have to make. Eventually, inevitably, she made her way back to him. "Having fun?" she asked, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of punch. "More than I expected," he admitted, taking the offered cup. "That's what happens when you let yourself be part of things. The world surprises you." She sipped her punch, then made a face. "Though Mrs. Carlson's punch recipe remains consistently terrible, I think she uses sugar as a suggestion rather than a measurement." Jonah tried his and had to agree. It was aggressively sweet, bordering on undrinkable. "Maybe that's the surprise you were talking about." "The bad kind, yes." Clara set her cup aside on a nearby table, abandoning it without guilt. "Walk with me. I need some air, and I suspect you do too." They slipped out through the side door into the quiet of the winter night. Snow was falling again, gentle flakes drifting down like a benediction. The noise of the gathering faded behind them, muffled by the church walls and the snow's strange acoustic. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, breathing in the cold air. "Better, I love them all, but sometimes the noise is just a lot." "I know the feeling." They walked in companionable silence for a bit, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow, leaving tracks that would be covered by morning. The church sat on the edge of town, and beyond it stretched the open country, dark fields and darker mountains, the world reduced to shapes and shadows. "Can I ask you something?" Clara's voice was quiet, almost tentative. "And will you promise to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is mind your own business?" Jonah's heart rate picked up, some instinct warning him that whatever was coming would matter. "I'll promise to try." "Fair enough." Clara stopped walking, turning to face him. The snow caught in her hair, melted on her cheeks, and her expression was serious. "Why did you really come tonight? And don't say it was for the bread or the carols or any other polite deflection. Why, Jonah?" Here it was, the question beneath all questions, the one he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd decided to attend. He could lie, could retreat into the safety of casual explanations. But Clara had asked for honesty, and standing there in the snow with her eyes searching his face, Jonah found he didn't want to lie. Not to her. Not anymore. "Because you asked me to," he said simply. "Because you made me think maybe I'd been wrong. About staying separate. About keeping everyone at a distance. Because you—" He paused, searching for words. "Because you make me want things I swore I'd never want again." Clara was very still, snowflakes landing on her shoulders, in her hair. "What things?" "Connection. Trust." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and raw. Jonah waited for her response, for rejection, or worse, for pity. But Clara just stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes, close enough that their breath mingled in the cold air. "You've said no to half the town's women," she said quietly, and there was an echo in her words, a callback to something. So let me ask you now, and you answer true. You want a wife, Jonah Briggs, or just another winter alone? The question hit him like a hammer to the chest, direct, unflinching, demanding truth in return for truth. It was the question he'd been asking himself without realizing it, the choice he'd been circling around since the day Clara Monroe walked into his shop. A wife meant risk. It meant opening himself to the possibility of betrayal, of loss, of all the pain he'd endured with Rebecca and swore never to endure again. It meant trusting someone with the parts of himself he'd locked away, hoping they wouldn't use that trust as a weapon. But another winter alone? That meant safety, yes. Protection. But it also meant nights by a cold forge, mornings without purpose beyond the work, years stretching ahead filled with craftsmanship but devoid of companionship. It meant becoming the man Timothy Crane described, heart of iron, cold and unyielding and ultimately empty. Jonah looked at Clara, really looked at her, saw the hope and fear warring in her expression, the bravery it took to ask such a question, to put herself forward when she knew his history of refusal. She wasn't Rebecca, wasn't any of the others. She was Clara, honest, direct, unafraid to see him clearly and still stand here in the snow, waiting for his answer. His voice cracked, and he had to start again. I don't want to be alone anymore, Clara. I don't want another winter, another year, another goddamn day of pretending I'm content with walls and distance and safety. The words came faster now, years of suppressed feeling rising like water breaching a dam. But I'm terrified, because wanting something means it can be taken away, and I don't know if I can survive that again. I know, Clara said, and she reached up to touch his face, her hand gentle against his cold skin. I know you're scared, Jonah, but so am I. You think I don't risk anything by standing here asking you this? You think it doesn't terrify me that you might say no, that I might have read everything wrong? You didn't read it wrong. Then stop running. Her voice was fierce now, urgent. Stop hiding behind what Rebecca did, behind what might happen. Look at what's right here, right now. Look at me and tell me you don't feel this. Tell me I'm alone in this and I'll walk away. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then stop being so damn afraid of it. Jonah's control shattered. Years of carefully maintained composure, of disciplined emotion, of walls built brick by brick, all of it crumbled under the weight of Clara's words, her touch, her presence. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her as if she might disappear if he didn't hold tight, and buried his face in her hair. I feel it, he whispered against her temple. God help me, Clara. I feel it. You scare the hell out of me, but I feel it. Clara's arms came around him, holding him just as tightly, and they stood there in the falling snow, two people who'd both known loss and loneliness choosing, in that moment, to be brave enough for something else. When they finally pulled apart, Clara was smiling through tears, and Jonah realized his own eyes were wet. So what now? He asked, feeling lost and found all at once. Now we figure it out together, Clara said. We take it slow, we talk honestly, we see where this goes, and when you get scared, because you will get scared, you tell me instead of running. Deal? Deal. The word felt like a vow, like a promise more binding than any he'd made before. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and brief, a seal on their agreement. Then she took his hand, lacing their fingers together, and led him back toward the church. We should get back before they send a search party. You know how this town talks. Let them talk, Jonah said, and meant it. For the first time in years, he didn't care about the gossip, the speculation, the knowing looks. Let them see him with Clara. Let them know he'd chosen to step out of the cold. As they walked back through the snow, Jonah felt something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Hope, fragile but real. The future was uncertain, the risks remained, and his fears hadn't magically disappeared. But Clara's hand was warm in his, her presence solid and real, and for now, that was enough. The church door opened, spilling light and warmth and the sound of joy to the world into the night. Clara paused on the threshold, looking back at him. Ready? She asked. Jonah squeezed her hand, taking a breath that felt like the first real breath he'd taken in years. Ready. And together, they stepped into the light. The news spread through Sage Hollow faster than wildfire through dry brush. By the time Christmas morning dawned, clear and cold, Every soul in town knew that Jonah Briggs had walked into the church gathering with Clara Monroe and walked out holding her hand. The same Jonah Briggs who'd turned down proposals and shut down advances for 5 solid years had finally, publicly, declared his interest in a woman. The gossip reached fevered pitch at the general store, where Margaret Wilson held court among the other ladies, her voice carrying over the pickle barrels and flour sacks. "I saw them with my own eyes," she declared, arranging her purchases with theatrical precision. "Standing outside the church, close as you please, and when they came back in, Lord have mercy, you could see it written all over both their faces." "See what exactly?" asked Sarah Beth Porter, though her pinched expression suggested she knew perfectly well. "That they'd come to an understanding, that our Mr. Briggs has finally decided to rejoin the land of the living." Margaret's tone carried equal parts satisfaction and resentment. Satisfaction that Jonah had finally chosen someone. Resentment that it wasn't her. Dolores from the saloon, picking up supplies for the kitchen, snorted. About damn time. Man was turning into a ghost, haunting that forge like some kind of tortured spirit. At least Miss Monroe had the sense to call him on it. What did she say to him? This from young Emma Hutchins, the Reverend's niece, eyes wide with romantic speculation. How did she get him to change his mind when no one else could? That, Margaret said with the authority of someone who'd made it her business to find out, is the question, isn't it? Though I heard from Betty Carson, who heard from her husband, who was near the door when they came back in, that Miss Monroe looked like a woman who'd won a hard-fought battle. The conversation would have continued indefinitely, spinning theories and embellishing details, except that the subject of their speculation walked through the door at that precise moment. Jonah stood in the entrance of the general store, taking in the tableau, the clustered women, the sudden silence, the guilty expressions of people caught talking about someone now standing right in front of them. A month ago, he would have turned around and left, but Clara's words from the night before echoed in his mind. "When you get scared, you tell me instead of running." He wasn't running anymore. "Ladies," he said with a nod, and walked past them to the counter where Henry Morrison stood, trying very hard to look like he hadn't been listening to every word. "Jonah," Henry managed, his professional demeanor struggling against obvious curiosity. "What can I get for you?" "Coffee beans, 2 pounds, sugar, 5 pounds, flour, 10 pounds. Jonah recited his list, aware of the women behind him pretending to shop, while clearly straining to hear. "And I'll need some of that good tea you keep in the back, the kind Mrs. Morrison likes, not the regular stock." Henry's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Jonah Briggs didn't drink tea, never had, which meant this purchase was for someone else, someone female, someone who might be visiting his cabin for tea. The implications hung in the air like smoke. "Right away," Henry said, and busied himself gathering the items while the whispers resumed behind Jonah, quieter but no less intense. Jonah paid, collected his purchases, and was almost to the door when Margaret Wilson's voice stopped him. "Mr. Briggs?" He turned, meeting her gaze steadily. There was something in her expression, not quite hostility, but a need for acknowledgement, for closure perhaps. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson? I hope you'll be very happy." She said it stiffly, the words clearly costing her something, but she said them nonetheless. "Miss Monroe is a fine woman. You've made a good choice." It was as close to a blessing as he was likely to get from someone he'd refused, and Jonah recognized the generosity in it. "Thank you, ma'am. That's kind of you to say." He left then, stepping out into the bright winter morning, and if he heard the explosion of speculation that erupted the moment the door closed behind him, he chose to ignore it. Let them talk. They were going to anyway, and he had more important things to think about, like the fact that Clara was coming to dinner at his cabin tonight, and he needed to make sure the place didn't look like the bachelor quarters it had been for the past 5 years. The cabin sat about a quarter-mile from the edge of town, close enough to walk to the forge, but far enough for privacy. Jonah had built it with his father when he was 17, adding to it over the years as needs and ambitions changed. The addition he'd started for Rebecca had never been finished. He'd torn down the framing after she left, unable to bear the sight of those hopeful walls. Now, looking at the space with Clara in mind, he wondered if it was time to build again. But first, he needed to clean. Jonah attacked the cabin with the same focused intensity he brought to his forge work. He swept floors that hadn't seen a broom in weeks, scrubbed the table until the wood gleamed, washed windows that had grown gray with dust and smoke. He changed the bedding. Not that Clara would see the bedroom, but it felt important to have everything clean, everything ready. The books on his shelf got dusted and straightened. The dishes got washed and properly stored instead of being left in a haphazard stack. Even his clothes got organized, hung on pegs instead of draped over chairs. By mid-afternoon, this cabin looked more like a home than it had in years, and Jonah stood in the middle of it feeling both proud and terrified. This was real now. Clara was coming here, into his private space, and after tonight there would be no more pretending that this was casual, that his feelings were anything less than serious. He started dinner preparations with the same nervous energy. Venison stew, his father's recipe, the one thing besides bread that he could make reliably well. He cut vegetables with precise knife work, browned the meat with care, added herbs and stock, and set it all to simmer. The cabin filled with rich, savory smells, and Jonah tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd cooked for anyone but himself. Clara arrived exactly at 6, knocking on the door with a confidence that belied any nervousness she might feel. Jonah opened it to find her standing on his porch, cheeks pink from the cold, holding a pie covered with a checked cloth. "Apple," she said by way of greeting. "I figured if I was coming for dinner, I should contribute something, and pie is about the extent of my cooking skills beyond the basics." "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I wanted to." She stepped inside, and Jonah was suddenly hyper-aware of every detail of his cabin through her eyes. The simple furniture, the spare decoration, the essential functionality of a space designed for solitude. But Clara didn't look disappointed. She looked interested, moving through the room with the same careful attention she'd given his forge, taking in the details that revealed who he was. "These are beautiful," she said, stopping at the mantel where he kept a few pieces. Small sculptures he'd made for himself over the years. A horse in mid-gallop, a bird with wings spread, a mountain lion crouched and ready. Things he'd never shown anyone, never tried to sell, just made because something in him needed to create them. "Just practice pieces," he said, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "They're art, Jonah. Why do you hide them away like secrets?" "Because they are secrets, I suppose. The part of the work that's just for me, not for selling or practical use." Clara picked up the horse, turning it in the lamplight. "The weather vane. The one in your sketches. This is what it would look like." "Similar, yes. You should make it. Put it on your roof. Let everyone see it. Let them know there's more to Jonah Briggs than horseshoes and practical ironwork." Jonah took the horse from her hands, setting it back on the mantel with care. "Maybe someday. Right now I've got stew that needs attending." They ate at his table, the one he'd scrubbed that morning, and conversation flowed easier than Jonah had expected. Clara told him about her students, about young Tommy Henderson, who could barely sit still but had a gift for numbers that surprised even her, about little Sarah Yates, who struggled with reading but drew pictures that showed a remarkable eye for detail. "They're good kids," she said, sopping up stew with a piece of bread. "Wild sometimes, unfocused, but good hearts. All of them. Even the troublemakers." "Were you a troublemaker? As a child?" Clara laughed. "God, yes. Drove Mrs. Brennan half to distraction with questions. I wanted to know the why of everything. Couldn't just accept information without understanding the reasoning behind it. But why does water freeze at that temperature and not another? But why do birds fly south? But why can't women vote if they're citizens too?" That last one's a fair question. Mrs. Brennan thought so too, which is probably why she put up with me. She encouraged the questioning even when it was inconvenient. Said that curiosity was a gift, not a burden. Claire's expression grew wistful. "I try to do the same with my students. Even the annoying questions deserve real answers." Jonah found himself telling her about his own childhood, about his father teaching him the forge, about the first piece he ever made. A simple nail that had bent crooked, but his father had kept it anyway, said it proved Jonah was learning. "He sounds like he was a good man. The best. Patient when I needed patience, firm when I needed direction. He died when I was 22, accident at the forge. Iron slag caught him across the chest, burned through to the bone. He lived 3 days after, long enough to make me promise I'd keep the business going, that I'd honor the craft." "And you have." More than kept it going, you've elevated it. I've tried. Some days I feel like I'm still that kid making crooked nails, hoping my father won't be disappointed. Clara reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. He wouldn't be disappointed, Jonah. He'd be proud. Anyone with eyes can see the quality of what you do, the care you put into every piece. The touch of her hand, the conviction in her voice, made something warm bloom in Jonah's chest. This was what he'd been missing, he realized. Not just companionship, but this. Someone who saw him clearly and still found something worth praising, worth believing in. They moved to the chairs by the fireplace after dinner, Clara insisting on helping with the dishes despite Jonah's protests. The pie sat between them, half-eaten and excellent, and the fire crackled with a contentment that matched the mood in the room. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said after a comfortable silence. "About Rebecca." Jonah tensed, old defenses rising automatically. But he'd promised honesty, promised not to run, so he nodded. "What do you need to know? What did she take from you? When she left, what did she steal that made you so certain you'd never want to risk it again?" It was a perceptive question, cutting right to the heart of things. Jonah stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift, and tried to find words for something he'd never properly articulated. "My belief in permanence, I suppose. In the idea that if you did everything right, if you were honest and hardworking and faithful, that would be enough. That love, real love, wasn't conditional on circumstances or opportunity." He paused, the old bitterness rising like bile. "Rebecca showed me that everything has a price, including devotion. She looked at what I could offer versus what Thomas Whitmore could offer, and I came up short, simple economics. That wasn't about you being insufficient, Jonah. That was about her values being skewed. Maybe, but it still hurt like hell, and it still taught me that trusting someone with your future is just asking for betrayal." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "I can't promise I'll never hurt you. No one can promise that because we're all human and we're all flawed, and sometimes we hurt the people we care about even when we don't mean to. But I can promise that I won't betray you for money or status or anything else that catches my eye. I'm not Rebecca, Jonah. My word means something, and when I commit to something or someone, I don't walk away just because it gets hard or something shinier comes along." "How can you be sure? How can anyone be sure they won't change their mind when tested?" "Because I've been tested already. I've had offers, Jonah. Proposals from men with more money, more prospects. A lawyer in Kansas City, a ranch owner in Wyoming who could have given me a life of comfort. I said no because they weren't what I wanted. They were safe, practical, logical choices, and I didn't want logic. I wanted—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I wanted someone who understood that some things matter more than security. Someone who created beauty because they had to, not because it was profitable. Someone who'd been broken and had the courage to keep going anyway. Is that what you see when you look at me? Someone broken? I see someone who's been hurt and survived it. That's not the same as broken. That's just human. We've all got scars, Jonah. The question is whether we let them define us or just acknowledge them as part of our story." Jonah turned to look at her fully. This woman who'd walked into his life and refused to accept his walls, his distance, his carefully maintained isolation. In the firelight, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional features and everything to do with the strength of her spirit, the clarity of her gaze. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be with someone, how to trust again. I'm going to be bad at it, Clara. I'm going to pull away when I should lean in. I'm going to assume the worst when I should hope for the best, and I'm probably going to drive you crazy with my stubborn refusal to believe this is real." "I know," Clara said simply. "And when you do those things, I'm going to call you on it. I'm going to remind you that fear is just fear, not prophecy. And eventually, maybe you'll start to believe that this, us, can be different from what came before. You make it sound simple. It's not simple at all. It's probably going to be the hardest thing either of us does, but I think it's worth it. Don't you?" Did he? That was the question, wasn't it? Was the possibility of happiness worth the certainty of vulnerability? Was the chance of something real worth the risk of devastating loss? Jonah thought about his cabin before Clara, about the clean emptiness of it, the way silence had been his only companion for so long. He thought about his forge, the work that satisfied his hands but left his heart untouched. He thought about the weather-vane sketch that never became reality, because creating something beautiful felt pointless when there was no one to share it with. And he thought about Christmas Eve, about standing in the snow with Clara asking him the question that changed everything. "You want a wife, or just another winter alone?" "Yes," he said finally. "It's worth it. You're worth it." Clara's smile was radiant, transforming her whole face, and she leaned forward to kiss him. Not the brief press of lips from the night before, but something deeper, more certain. Jonah responded instinctively, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone as years of denial and discipline shattered under the simple truth of wanting this, wanting her. When they broke apart, both breathing harder, Clara rested her forehead against his. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "Maybe not perfect, maybe not easy, but okay. I believe that. I'm trying to believe it too. That's enough. Trying is enough." They sat together by the fire until it burned low, talking and occasionally lapsing into comfortable silence, and Jonah felt something shift in the foundation of his world. This was what the beginning of something felt like. Not the desperate passion he'd felt with Rebecca, all heat and no substance, but something steadier, deeper, something that might actually last. When Clara finally rose to leave, pulling on her coat and wrapping her scarf against the night cold, Jonah walked her to the door and then, on impulse, decided to walk her all the way home. "You don't have to," she protested. "It's freezing, and you've got an early start tomorrow." "I know I don't have to. I want to." So they walked through the quiet streets of Sage Hollow, the snow crunching under their boots, their breath fogging in the air. Lights glowed in windows, and somewhere a dog barked, but otherwise the town slept peacefully. Above them, stars scattered across a sky so clear it looked like you could reach up and touch them. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Clara asked suddenly. "Going somewhere bigger, somewhere your work might be more appreciated?" "Sometimes. But this is home. My father's buried here, my mother beside him. The forge is here. Seems like running away to leave all that behind." "It wouldn't be running away if it was running toward something, toward opportunity, toward growth." "Is that what you're planning? To move on when your contract is up?" Clara was quiet for a few steps. "I don't know anymore. A week ago I would have said probably yes. I tend to move around, never putting down roots too deep. But now," she squeezed his hand, "now I'm thinking maybe roots aren't such a bad thing, if they're in the right soil." They reached the dress shop where Clara rented her room, the stairs leading up to her door illuminated by a single lamp in the window. She turned to face him, and in the lamplight her expression was serious. "Jonah, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to push you faster than you can go, but I'm also not going to let you sabotage this out of fear. We're partners in this, equals, which means when you're struggling, you tell me, and when I need reassurance, I'll tell you. Deal?" "Deal. And one more thing." She rose on her toes, bringing her lips close to his ear. "Stop thinking of yourself as a man no woman would want. You're intelligent, skilled, handsome when you're not scowling, and you have a good heart under all that armor. Any woman would be lucky to have you. I'm just the one smart enough to fight for it." Before Jonah could respond, she kissed him again, quick and decisive, and then disappeared up the stairs, leaving him standing in the cold with his heart pounding and his mind reeling. As he walked back to his cabin alone, Jonah couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. For the first time in 5 years, the future looked like something other than an endless repetition of solitary days. It looked like possibility, like potential, like a story that was just beginning to be written. The next weeks passed in a rhythm that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Jonah and Clara settled into a pattern of dinners together, walks through town, stolen moments between her teaching and his forge work. They learned each other in increments. Her habit of humming while she graded papers, his tendency to work through problems by talking to his horse, her fierce protectiveness of her students, his hidden gentleness with anything fragile or new. The town watched with barely concealed fascination. Sage Hollow had seen Jonah Briggs keep the world at arm's length for so long that his transformation was like watching stone become water. Impossible, miraculous, slightly unnerving. He actually smiles now, Timothy Crane observed to his whittling companions one afternoon. Saw him on the street yesterday, and he was smiling at nothing in particular, just happy to be alive, seemed like. Love'll do that to a man, another replied. Make him soft. Question is whether it lasts or whether he'll wise up and remember why he kept clear of it for so long. But Jonah wasn't interested in wising up or keeping clear. For the first time since Rebecca, he was allowing himself to feel, to hope, to imagine a future that included someone else. It was terrifying. Every moment with Clara carried the weight of potential loss. But it was also extraordinary. Clara, for her part, seemed to understand his struggle without him having to voice it. When he grew quiet and distant, retreating into his head where old fears whispered warnings, she didn't demand explanation or reassurance. She simply waited, present and patient, until he found his way back to her. "Where'd you go?" she asked one evening when he'd been silent through most of dinner, lost in thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. "Nowhere good. Just worrying about things that haven't happened and probably won't." "Rebecca things?" "Rebecca things," he confirmed. Clara set down her fork, giving him her full attention. "Tell me. It's foolish. Tell me anyway." So he did, haltingly at first and then with gathering momentum. He told her about the fear that gnawed at him in quiet moments, the certainty that this happiness was temporary, that eventually she'd see through to his inadequacies and realize she'd made a mistake. He told her about waking in the night, convinced that morning would bring news of her departure, some better offer, some revelation that he wasn't enough. Clara listened without interruption, and when he finished, she reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Jonah. Not for another man, not for more money, not because you have bad days or dark thoughts or moments when you can't believe this is real. I'm here because I choose to be here, and that choice isn't dependent on you being perfect or always happy or never afraid." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know myself, because I've spent 30 years learning what I want and what I don't. And I want this. I want you. Stubborn, scarred, skeptical you. And nothing you're afraid of changes that." Jonah wanted desperately to believe her, to let her certainty become his own. But 5 years of self-protection didn't dissolve overnight, and the voice of doubt was persistent and familiar. "I'm trying, Clara. I swear I'm trying to trust this." "I know you are. And that's enough for now. The rest will come." January arrived with brutal cold, the kind that made metal brittle and fingers ache even in gloves. Jonah's forge work became a battle against the weather, keeping the fire hot enough to work the iron while the wind tried to steal the heat away. He added extra layers, wrapped his hands, and cursed the cold with creative profanity that would have made his mother blush. Clara's schoolhouse faced its own challenges. The pot-bellied stove struggled to heat the large room, and the children arrived each morning bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, reluctant to remove enough layers to write properly. "I can't feel my fingers, Miss Monroe," Tommy Henderson complained one particularly frigid morning, holding up hands that were indeed worryingly pale. Clara had him stand by the stove, rubbing warmth back into his hands while she adjusted the lesson plan. Reading aloud today instead of writing, at least that would keep them moving, keep the blood flowing. Jonah heard about these struggles when Clara came to dinner that night, exhausted and frustrated. "I can't teach them if they're freezing," she said, accepting the hot tea he'd prepared. "Half of them can barely concentrate, and the little ones just sit there shivering. It's not fair to them, and I don't know how to fix it." An idea was forming in Jonah's mind, something that would require work and time but might actually help. What if the stove wasn't the only source of heat? "What do you mean?" "Heat rises, right? What if there were iron grates in the floor near the stove, letting the warmth spread more evenly? And metal reflectors behind the stove, directing heat out into the room instead of losing it through the walls?" Clara's eyes lit with interest. "Could you do that? Make something like that?" "I'd have to see the space, take measurements, figure out what's feasible. But yes, I think so. Might take a few weeks to fabricate everything, and installation would have to happen on a weekend when school's not in session, but it's possible." "Jonah, that would be—" She trailed off, seemingly overcome. "The town can't afford to pay you for something like that. The school budget barely covers books and supplies." "Did I ask for payment?" You can't just donate your time and materials. That's not fair to you. Can't I? He met her eyes steadily. Those are your students, Clara. You care about them, which means I care about them. If I can make their learning environment better, why shouldn't I? Because it's a huge undertaking, because you've got paying work to do, because nothing. I'm doing this. You can argue if it makes you feel better, but you're not going to change my mind. Clara stared at him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, her eyes filled with tears. Hey, he said, alarmed. I didn't mean to upset you. You didn't. She brushed at her eyes impatiently. I'm not upset. I'm just... God, Jonah, do you have any idea what this means? That you do this not because you have to or because someone's paying you, but just because it's right? It's not that remarkable. It is to me. It is to those children who won't have to suffer through the rest of winter with frozen fingers. She stood, circling the table to wrap her arms around him. Thank you. Truly, deeply, thank you. Jonah held her, feeling the dampness of her tears against his shirt, and something settled deeper in his chest. This was what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. To see a need and have the ability to meet it, to use his skills not just for profit, but for purpose. Rebecca had made him feel like his worth was tied to his earning potential, but Clara showed him something different. She showed him that value came from character, from generosity, from choosing to make the world better in whatever small ways you could. The next day, Sunday, Jonah went to the schoolhouse with his measuring tools. Clara met him there, and together they examined the space, discussing possibilities and limitations. If I put grates here and here, Jonah said, marking spots on the floor with chalk, the convection should carry warmth throughout the room. And these reflectors, he gestured to the wall behind the stove, they'll bounce heat forward instead of letting it escape. How long will it take? 3 weeks? Maybe 4? I'll have to work on it between other commissions, but it's manageable. Clara walked the room, imagining the changes, and her excitement was palpable. The children are going to be so surprised. They won't know what to think. Tell them a friend of the school made some improvements. They don't need to know it was me. Why not? You should get credit for this, Jonah. Because that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for you, for them, not for recognition or gratitude. Clara stopped her pacing, turning to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're a good man, Jonah Briggs, better than you give yourself credit for. I'm just a blacksmith trying to help where I can. You're so much more than that. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. How's that? She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands with a tenderness that made his breath catch. As someone honorable, someone who keeps his word and protects what matters and creates beauty even when no one's watching, someone worth loving. The last words hit him like a physical blow. Love. She hadn't said she loved him, not explicitly, but the implication hung in the air between them, weightier than any iron he'd ever worked. Clara, you don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for declarations or promises beyond what we've already made. I just need you to know that's how I see you. That's who you are to me. Jonah pulled her close, holding her against his chest where his heart hammered with emotion he didn't have words for. Not yet. But maybe soon. Maybe, eventually, he'd find the courage to say what he was beginning to feel. That Clara Monroe had become necessary to him. That the thought of life without her was unbearable. That love might not be the trap he'd thought it was, but rather the key to a door he'd kept locked too long. For now, he just held her in the cold schoolhouse and let himself believe just for a moment that happiness wasn't a lie waiting to betray him, but a truth he was finally brave enough to claim. The weeks of January passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. Jonah divided his time between regular commissions and the schoolhouse project, often working late into the night to stay on schedule. Clara would sometimes bring dinner to the forge, sitting on a stool near the fire and grading papers while he worked, the two of them comfortable in shared silence, broken only by the hammer's ring and the scratch of her pen. The heating system for the schoolhouse took shape piece by piece, iron grates with decorative scrollwork because Jonah couldn't help himself, reflectors hammered to precise curves for optimal heat distribution, mounting brackets designed for stability and longevity. It was some of his finest work, not because it was complex, but because it mattered. During this time, Jonah noticed changes in himself that had nothing to do with Clara and everything to do with her. He smiled more, as Timothy Crane had observed. He engaged in conversations with townsfolk instead of keeping them brief and impersonal. He attended church on Sundays not out of obligation, but because Clara would be there, and sitting beside her while Reverend Hutchins droned on about salvation felt like its own kind of grace. The town's perception of him shifted too. The whispers changed from speculation about his reclusiveness to approval of his relationship with Clara, from judgment about his past rejections to appreciation for his present choice. People greeted him more warmly, included him in conversations, treated him less like an oddity, and more like a valued member of the community. It should have felt good. And it did, mostly. But there was a part of Jonah that resented it too. The fact that he'd been acceptable all along, but only became accepted when he conformed to their expectations of what a man should be. With a woman, open to connection, participating in the social fabric of the town. "Does it bother you?" Clara asked one evening when he'd mentioned this feeling. "That they approve of you now in a way they didn't before?" "Sometimes. Feels like I was being punished for grief, for protecting myself. Like my worth as a person was contingent on my availability as a romantic prospect." That's because, to some degree, it was. People are uncomfortable with those who don't follow the expected patterns. You were a reminder that not everyone wants or needs partnership, and that made them question their own choices. Clara's insight was, as always, uncomfortably accurate. But try to see it differently. They're not accepting you now because you're with me. They're accepting you because you're letting them see who you've been all along. Someone capable of connection, of generosity, of caring. You hid that for 5 years, and now you're not hiding anymore. "I wasn't hiding. I was protecting myself." Those can be the same thing, Jonah. Protection and hiding, safety and isolation, the line between them is thinner than we like to admit. He knew she was right, even if it rankled. He had been hiding, using his forge and his solitude as shields against a world that had hurt him. And now, with Clara's help, he was stepping back into that world, testing whether it was safe, whether he could survive being vulnerable again. So far, he hadn't shattered. That had to count for something. The schoolhouse heating system was installed on a Saturday in late January, with Jonah working from dawn until well past dark to complete the job. Harold Peterson helped with some of the heavy lifting, and even Timothy Crane stopped by to offer advice that was occasionally useful and mostly just commentary on Jonah's technique. When it was finished, Jonah stood back and surveyed his work with critical eyes. The grates were level and secure. The reflectors positioned perfectly. The whole system integrated into the existing structure as if it had always been there. He lit the stove and waited, watching as heat began to spread through the room in ways it never had before. Clara arrived just as he was testing the temperature in the far corners, her face bright with cold and anticipation. "Well?" she asked. "Does it work?" "Feel for yourself." She walked to the back of the room, the area that was usually frigid no matter how high the stove burned, and her expression transformed into pure delight. "Jonah, it's warm. Actually, warm. The children are going to be able to sit anywhere in the room and be comfortable." She spun in a circle, laughing with joy. "This is going to change everything. Focus, concentration, comfort. All of it better because of what you've done." Pride swelled in Jonah's chest, the kind that came not from praise but from knowing he'd made a real difference. "Good. That's what I hoped for." Clara crossed the room to him, taking his hands, rough and calloused from the day's work, in hers. "I don't know how to thank you properly. This is beyond generous, beyond kind. It's transformative. Seeing you this happy is thanks enough." "Is it? Is that really all you want?" There was something in her tone, something weighted with meaning he couldn't quite interpret. "What else would I want?" "I don't know. Maybe—" She paused, seemed to gather courage. "Maybe to know that this, what we have, is as important to me as it seems to be to you. That I'm not just grateful for what you do, but for who you are. That when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Jonah's heart stuttered. This was as close to a declaration as Clara had come, and the vulnerability in her expression mirrored what he felt inside. The hope and the terror, the wanting and the fear of wanting too much. "Clara, He stopped, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. I'm not good at this, at saying what I feel. But you should know that you've changed things for me. Changed me. I don't know what the future holds, and I'm still scared of 100 different things, but I know I want you in it. However that looks, whatever that means, I want you there. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a grand declaration or a romantic speech, but it was true, and it was his. And when Claire's eyes filled with tears of happiness, Jonah knew it was enough. She kissed him there in the warm schoolhouse, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the promise of what they were building together. Not just a heating system, but a life. A shared future that was starting to seem not just possible, but inevitable. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her head against his chest, and Jonah wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this, for everything, for being brave enough to try. Thank you for making me want to." They stood together as the winter evening deepened outside, as the stove crackled and the new heating system proved its worth, and Jonah felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the peace of resignation or the peace of numbness, but the genuine article. The peace of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with. It wouldn't last. Peace never did. The world had a way of disrupting even the most carefully constructed happiness. But for now, in this moment, it was real. And Jonah was learning, slowly, painfully, hopefully, to trust that real could also mean lasting. That love didn't have to be a betrayal waiting to happen. That maybe, just maybe, Clara Monroe was exactly what she appeared to be. A woman who chose him not despite his flaws, but including them, who saw his wounds and didn't flinch, who believed in a future they could build together. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. But he was done running from terror. Done letting fear make his decisions. Whatever came next, he would face it. With Clara beside him, he would face it. And that, he was learning, was what courage actually looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward anyway, to trust despite the risk, to love even when love had burned you before. As they left the schoolhouse together, stepping out into the cold January night, Jonah took Clara's hand and held it tight. The future was still uncertain. His fears hadn't vanished. The scars from Rebecca still ached on the coldest days. But Clara's hand was warm in his. Her smile was bright in the darkness. And for the first time in 5 long years, Jonah Briggs believed that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. February came in with deceptive mildness, temperatures climbing just enough to suggest that winter might be loosening its grip. The snow turned soft and wet. Icicles dripped from eaves like slow tears, and for a few days Sage Hollow dared to hope for an early spring. Then the storm warnings started. Old-timers like Timothy Crane studied the sky with narrowed eyes, reading signs in the clouds and the wind that younger folks had never learned to interpret. The horses grew restless in their stables, pawing at the ground and whinnying at nothing. Birds that should have been starting their migration north stayed stubbornly put, huddled in the shelter of barn eaves and pine branches. "Big one coming," Timothy declared at the general store, his pronouncement carrying the weight of 60 years of mountain winters. "Bigger than we've seen in a decade, maybe more. You mark my words, this valley's about to get buried." "How long?" Henry Morrison asked, already mentally cataloging his inventory, calculating what people would need if they got snowed in for weeks. "Day, maybe 2. But when she hits, she'll hit hard. Temperature's going to drop like a stone, wind's going to howl like the devil himself, and the snow—" He shook his head gravely. "The snow's going to fall until you can't remember what the ground looks like." The town took the warning seriously. Families stocked up on supplies, flour and beans and coffee, lamp oil and firewood and feed for livestock. Storm shutters got checked and reinforced, roofs got inspected for weak spots, and everyone who could spare the time spent it preparing for a siege by weather. Jonah heard the warnings and made his own preparations. He brought in extra coal for the forge, stocked his cabin with enough food to last a month if necessary, and made sure his woodpile was covered and accessible. He checked on his neighbors, too. The widow Grayson down the road, old Ben Tucker who lived alone and sometimes forgot to eat when his rheumatism got bad. It was what you did in a place like this. You looked out for each other because when the mountains decided to remind you how small you were, community was the only thing that kept you alive. But his thoughts kept returning to Clara. Her room above the dress shop was solid enough, but if the storm was as bad as predicted, she'd be isolated there. The schoolhouse would have to close. No parent would send their children out in a blizzard, and Clara would be alone with nothing but books and silence while the wind tried to tear the town apart. He found her at the schoolhouse that afternoon, dismissing her students early with stern instructions to go straight home and help their families prepare. "No dawdling," she called after Tommy Henderson, who was already plotting some mischief with his friends. "Your mother will need help securing the chicken coop, and I expect you to be useful, not underfoot." "Yes, Miss Monroe," Tommy yelled back, his tone suggesting he'd completely ignored her words. Clara sighed, shaking her head, but she was smiling. She always smiled when it came to her students, even the troublesome ones. Especially the troublesome ones. "Jonah," she said, noticing him by the gate, "I didn't expect to see you today. Shouldn't you be preparing for the storm?" "Already done. Came to see about you." "Me? I'm fine. I've got supplies, a good stove, plenty of books to keep me occupied if we're stuck indoors for a while." "How long can you keep that stove burning? How much wood do you have stored?" Clara's hesitation was answer enough. "Enough. Probably. The dress shop has a communal supply, and Mrs. Henley said I could use what I needed." Mrs. Henley's 80 years old and half deaf. If this storm is what they're predicting, you could be cut off from her, from the communal supply, from everything, snowed into that room with no way to get help if you need it. "So what are you suggesting?" The words came out before Jonah could second-guess them, before fear or propriety or common sense could intervene. "Come stay at my cabin, just until the storm passes. You'll have heat, food, safety, and you won't be alone if something goes wrong." Clara studied him with that direct gaze that always made him feel like she could see straight through to his bones. "Jonah, people will talk. A single woman staying at a bachelor's cabin, even with a storm as excuse, you know what they'll say. Let them say it. I care more about you being safe than I do about gossip." "Do you? Because a week ago you were still jumpy about holding my hand in public. Now you're inviting me to move into your cabin. Consequences be damned." There was challenge in her voice, but also something else. Hope, maybe, or curiosity about how serious he was, how far he'd come from the closed-off man she'd met 2 months ago. "A week ago I was still learning how to do this, how to be with someone. I'm still learning. But I know that the thought of you alone in that room, freezing or hungry or scared, makes me feel things I can't." He paused, searching for words. "I can't be that person anymore, Clara. The one who puts safety and appearances above everything else. Not when it comes to you." Clara set down the papers she'd been gathering, giving him her full attention. "And if I say yes? If I come to your cabin and the storm lasts a week, 2 weeks? If the whole town spends that time speculating about what we're doing, about whether we're—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung clear. "Then we deal with it together. We've been honest with each other from the start. We can be honest with them too. This is about survival, about basic human decency. If they want to make it into something scandalous, that's their failing, not ours." "You've really changed, haven't you? The Jonah Briggs I met in December would never have made this offer." "The Jonah Briggs you met in December was half alive and didn't know it. You changed that, changed me. And I'll be damned if I let you face this storm alone when I have the means to keep you safe." Clara walked to him, closing the distance until she stood close enough that he could see the flecks of green in her brown eyes, could count the freckles the winter sun had faded but not erased. She reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his bearded jaw. "Okay," she said simply. "I'll come. Not because I can't manage on my own. I could. But because I don't want to. Because the thought of riding out this storm with you sounds better than doing it alone." Relief flooded through Jonah, so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You might regret the offer when I'm underfoot for days on end, driving you crazy with questions and observations and general presence. I'll take that risk." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Clara packed what she'd need: clothes, books, her teaching materials in case the storm lasted long enough that she'd have lessons to plan. Jonah helped her carry everything to his cabin, making multiple trips through the increasingly ominous afternoon light. The temperature was already dropping, the mild spell breaking like a fever, and the wind carried a sharp edge that promised worse to come. By the time they had Clara settled, the first snowflakes were falling, small and hard, more like sleet than the soft flakes of earlier snowfalls. They hit the windows with tiny ticking sounds, and the wind began to rise, rattling the shutters Jonah had reinforced just that morning. "It's starting," Clara observed, standing at the window and watching the storm gather strength. "We're ready for it. Food, water, firewood, lamp oil, everything we need. Could last us a month if we're careful. Let's hope it doesn't come to that." That night they ate dinner by lamplight while the wind howled outside like something alive and angry. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault, but Jonah had built it well, built it strong, and it held against the storm's fury. They sat close to this fire, Clara in his father's old chair, and Jonah on the hearth, and talked about everything and nothing, her childhood in Kansas, his memories of his mother, the books they'd read, the dreams they'd harbored and abandoned and sometimes rekindled. "Did you ever want to leave?" Clara asked. "Really leave, not just think about it, but actually pack up and go?" "Once. Right after Rebecca. I thought maybe if I went somewhere no one knew me, somewhere I could start fresh, it would hurt less. But then I realized I'd just be bringing the pain with me, and at least here I had the forge, had work I knew, had my parents' graves to tend. Seemed foolish to run from ghosts when they'd just follow." "Ghosts do that. Follow, I mean. I've tried outrunning mine." "What ghosts are you running from?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost distant. "My father. Not his memory, he's still alive, far as I know. But the disappointment I saw in his eyes when I told him I wanted to teach instead of marry. The way he looked at me like I was choosing the harder path out of stubbornness rather than conviction." She paused. "He wanted me settled, safe, taken care of by a husband. Couldn't understand why I'd want independence more than security." "Did you ever reconcile before you left?" "No. He said I was being foolish, that teaching was no life for a woman, that I'd regret my choices when I was old and alone. I said at least I'd be alone on my own terms, not trapped in a marriage built on practicality instead of love. We haven't spoken since." Jonah heard the pain beneath her matter-of-fact tone, recognized it as an echo of his own wounds. "Do you regret it? The choice you made?" "Some days. When the loneliness gets heavy, when I'm in a new town where no one knows me, and I'm starting over for the 10th time. But then I remember why I chose this. The children, the difference I can make, the freedom to live according to my own values. And no, I don't regret it. I regret the rift with my father, but not the choice that caused it." "Would you ever reach out to him? Try to mend things?" "Maybe. If I ever had something to show him, some proof that my choices led somewhere good, a permanent position, a community I belong to, She trailed off, seeming to catch herself. "A what?" "A partner. Someone who saw value in what I do, who didn't need me to be smaller or quieter or more conventional to fit into their life. Someone who understood that independence and partnership aren't opposites." She looked at him directly. "Someone like you, Jonah." The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Jonah felt his heart rate increase, felt the familiar surge of fear and longing that came whenever they ventured into this territory. The future, the permanence, the possibility of building something that lasted. "Clara, A tremendous gust of wind slammed into the cabin, so forceful that the whole structure shuddered. Something outside, a shutter or a loose board, tore free with a crack like a gunshot. The lamp flames flickered wildly, and for a moment Jonah thought they might go out entirely, leaving them in darkness. But the flames steadied, the cabin held, and the moment of confession passed into concern for more immediate matters. "I need to check that," Jonah said, standing. "Something's come loose. You can't go out in this. The wind alone could knock you down." "I have to. If it's a shutter and it's banging against the cabin, it could do real damage. Break a window, damage the siding. Better to secure it now than deal with worse problems later." He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face against the cold, and opened the door just enough to slip through. The wind hit him immediately, a physical force that staggered him backward. Snow drove horizontally, stinging any exposed skin, and the cold was knife-sharp, the kind that found its way through any gap in clothing. Jonah fought his way around the cabin, one hand on the wall to keep oriented in the whiteout conditions. He found the damage on the north side. A shutter had torn half free and was slamming against the logs with destructive force. He wrestled it into submission, using nails from his pocket and a hammer he'd tucked into his belt, securing it as best he could in the howling chaos. By the time he made it back to the door, his hands were numb and his face felt frozen. Clara pulled him inside, slamming the door against the wind and throwing the bolt with shaking hands. God, Jonah, you're freezing. Get out of those clothes. Get by the fire. He obeyed mechanically, his fingers too cold to manage buttons. Clara helped him, her hands quick and efficient, stripping away the frozen outer layers and wrapping him in blankets she'd heated by the fire. She made him sit close to the flames, rubbing warmth back into his hands with a fierce determination that would have made him smile if his face had been capable of it. That was foolish, she said, her voice sharp with fear-turned anger. You could have gotten lost between here and the wall. People freeze to death 10 feet from their own doors in storms like this. Had to be done. Not at the cost of your life, it didn't. A shutter can be replaced. You can't. The vehemence in her voice, the naked fear in her eyes, struck something deep in Jonah's chest. She cared. Not in some abstract way, not as a matter of principle or affection, but with the kind of visceral terror that came from the thought of real loss. She cared about him the way he was beginning to realize he cared about her, desperately, irrationally, with an intensity that defied logic. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough from cold and emotion. You're right. It was stupid. I couldn't stand the thought of something happening to the cabin, of not being able to keep you safe. I don't need you to risk yourself to keep me safe. I need you alive, Jonah. I need you here, with me. Not frozen in a snowdrift because you were being heroic about a damn shutter. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, and Jonah pulled her to him despite the blankets, despite the awkwardness of the position. She came willingly, burying her face against his shoulder, and they sat there by the fire while the storm raged outside and something equally powerful raged between them. I'm sorry, he whispered again. I'm here. I'm fine. I'm not going anywhere. Promise me. Promise me you won't do something like that again. I promise. It was a promise he couldn't entirely keep. There would always be emergencies, always be situations where risk was necessary, but he meant it in the way that mattered. He wouldn't be reckless with his life, wouldn't treat his safety as less important than practical concerns. Because Clara was right. A shutter could be replaced, the cabin could be repaired. But if something happened to him, if he left her the way everyone else in her life had left her, that damage would be permanent. They stayed by the fire until Jonah's body temperature returned to normal, until his hands regained their color and flexibility, until Clara's tears dried and her breathing steadied. The storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin there was warmth and light and the complicated comfort of two people learning how much they meant to each other. We should sleep, Clara said eventually, though neither of them moved. It's late, and tomorrow will likely be more of the same. You take the bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire. Don't be ridiculous. It's your cabin, your bed. I'll sleep out here. Clara. Or we could both stop being stubborn and share the bed. It's big enough for two if we're not precious about it, and we're both adults who can exercise basic restraint and propriety. The suggestion hung in the air, practical and sensible and absolutely terrifying to Jonah. Sharing a bed meant intimacy of a different kind, meant trust and vulnerability and the kind of closeness that dissolved boundaries. But it also meant not sleeping on the hard floor, meant better rest for both of them, and meant acknowledging that what they had was strong enough to withstand proximity without devolving into something they weren't ready for. All right, he heard himself say, but I sleep on the side nearest the door, and you take the extra blanket. Deal. They prepared for bed with the self-consciousness of people hyper-aware of each other's movements. Clara changed in the bedroom while Jonah banked the fire and checked the door and windows one final time. When he entered the bedroom, she was already under the covers, turned toward the wall, giving him privacy to change. Jonah stripped down to his undershirt and long underwear, blew out the lamp, and climbed into bed, staying as far to his side as possible. The mattress was narrow enough that even with care they were close. He could feel her warmth, hear her breathing, sense every slight movement she made. Good night, Jonah, Clara whispered into the darkness. Good night. Sleep should have been impossible. Every nerve in Jonah's body was attuned to Clara's presence, every sound she made magnified in the intimate darkness. But exhaustion and the day's exertions took their toll, and gradually, incrementally, he felt himself drifting. The last thing he was aware of before sleep claimed him was Clara's hand finding his beneath the covers, her fingers lacing through his in a gesture that was both innocent and profound. He squeezed her hand gently, and she squeezed back, and they fell asleep that way, connected, trusting, together against the storm. The blizzard raged for 3 days. Jonah woke on the first morning to find Clara curled against him, her head on his shoulder and one arm draped across his chest. Sometime in the night they'd gravitated together, seeking warmth and comfort in sleep the way they were learning to do while awake. He should have moved, should have put proper distance between them, but the weight of her against him felt right in a way he couldn't articulate, so he stayed still, watching the gray storm light filter through the shutters, listening to the wind's fury, and feeling more at peace than he had in years. Clara stirred eventually, becoming aware of their position. She tensed, starting to pull away, but Jonah's arm tightened around her before he could think better of it. "Don't," he said quietly, "unless you want to, but don't pull away just because you think you should." She relaxed back against him, and he felt her smile against his shoulder. "I'm not very good at following rules about what I should and shouldn't do. I've noticed. And you're not very good at accepting good things when they happen to you. I've noticed that too." They lay there in the gray morning light, the storm a constant presence beyond the walls, and Jonah felt something shift in his understanding of what this was, what they were building. It wasn't just companionship or even romance in the conventional sense. It was partnership, the kind forged in trust and tested by circumstance. Clara had seen him at his most fearful, most resistant, most damaged, and hadn't flinched, and he'd seen her lonely and uncertain and fiercely independent, and loved her not despite those things, but because of them. Loved her. The realization should have terrified him. 2 months ago, it would have sent him running, but lying there with Clara in his arms, with a blizzard trying to bury the world outside, Jonah felt only a quiet certainty. He loved her. He loved Clara Monroe. Her stubborn honesty, her fierce compassion, her refusal to let him hide from himself. And someday soon, when the words didn't stick in his throat like broken glass, he'd tell her so. But not yet. Not when the emotion was so new, so fragile. First, he needed to prove it. Not with words, but with actions. With a steady demonstration of being present, being honest, being the man she deserved. They rose eventually, moving through the morning routine with practiced ease. Clara made coffee while Jonah rekindled the fire. They ate breakfast at the small table, playing cards afterward to pass the time, talking and reading and occasionally falling into comfortable silences. The second day brought a brief lull in the storm, the wind dropping to merely dangerous rather than catastrophic. Jonah ventured outside to check on the animals, his horse in the small barn, the chickens huddled in their coop. Everything was as secure as could be expected, though the snow had drifted to astonishing heights, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and otherworldly. Clara stood at the window when he returned, watching the white expanse with a mixture of awe and unease. "I've never seen snow like this," she said. "In Kansas, we got storms, but nothing like this. It's like the whole world has disappeared under it. This is nothing compared to what the old-timers talk about. The winter of '86, they say the snow fell for 2 weeks straight, buried entire buildings, lost livestock, lost people too, folks who got caught between the barn and the house and couldn't find their way back. That's terrifying. It's the mountains. They're beautiful, but they don't forgive mistakes. You respect them or you die. It's that simple." Clara turned from the window, studying him with thoughtful eyes. "Is that why you stay? Because the mountains demand respect, demand your full attention, because they don't lie or pretend to be something they're not?" The observation cut close to bone. "Maybe. After Rebecca, I needed something that made sense, that followed rules I could understand. Metal behaves predictably when you heat it right, shape it right. Mountains are the same, harsh but honest. Unlike people." "Unlike some people," Clara corrected. "Not all of us are liars or users, Jonah. Some of us say what we mean and mean what we say." "I know that now,"
You've shown me that. Have I? Because sometimes I wonder if you're waiting for me to prove you right, to show you that trust was a mistake, like you're braced for impact even when there's no collision coming. Jonah moved to stand beside her at the window, their reflections ghostly in the glass. You're right. I am braced, waiting for the other shoe to drop. 5 years of certainty that betrayal is inevitable doesn't evaporate in 2 months, no matter how much I want it to. But I'm trying, Clara. Every day I'm trying to believe that you're different, that this is different. What would it take? For you to really believe it, not just try to. Time, I think. Time and you not changing, not proving me right. Time and you just being you, honest and direct and present. Eventually, my fear will have to give way to evidence. Eventually, I'll have to accept that you're exactly who you appear to be. And if I'm not perfect, if I make mistakes, if I hurt you without meaning to, if I have bad days where I'm short-tempered or unfair, then we'll deal with it. Because that's being human, not being a liar. There's a difference between imperfection and betrayal, and I need to remember that. Clara took his hand, threading her fingers through his. We're both learning, aren't we? You're learning to trust again, and I'm learning how to love someone without losing myself in the process. It's not easy for either of us. No, but nothing worth having ever is. The third day of the storm was the worst. The wind reached speeds that made the cabin walls groan in protest, and the temperature plummeted until even the robust fire struggled to keep the space warm. Jonah and Clara stayed close to the hearth, wrapped in blankets, and read aloud to each other from the book she'd brought, poetry despite his protests, because she claimed emergency conditions warranted special measures. Listen to this one, Clara said, her voice carrying the rhythm of the verse. It's Whitman. I am large, I contain multitudes. Doesn't that capture something true? That we're all contradictions, all complexity, all these different versions of ourselves depending on circumstance and company? It's pretty words for a simple truth. People are complicated, not exactly a revelation. But it's how he says it that matters. I contain multitudes. Like we're universes unto ourselves, vast and varied. Like one person can be brave and frightened, generous and selfish, open and guarded all at once. Like you, Jonah. Me? Yes, you. You contain multitudes. The man who refuses every woman in town and the man who invites me to weather a storm in his cabin. The craftsman who works in brutal practicality and the artist who creates beauty no one else sees. The person who's terrified of trust and the person who keeps choosing it anyway, with me, every day. Jonah felt exposed by her words, seen in ways that were both uncomfortable and essential. I don't feel like multitudes. I feel like a mess of contradictions that don't add up to anything coherent. That's what multitudes are, though. Contradictions that somehow coexist, that somehow make a whole. You don't have to resolve into one simple thing to be valuable, to be lovable. Lovable. The word hit him square in the chest, and he looked at Clara with sudden intensity. Is that what you think? That I'm lovable? Clara set down the book, giving him her complete attention. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, and her expression was open, vulnerable in a way he rarely saw. Yes, she said simply. I think you're lovable. I think you're worth every moment of frustration, every instance of your stubbornness, every time you pull away because fear tells you to. I think you're worth the effort it takes to reach you, worth the patience it requires to wait for you to believe this is real. She paused, then continued with quiet certainty. And I think I'm falling in love with you, Jonah Briggs. Maybe I've already fallen. Maybe I was halfway there the moment you walked into that schoolhouse to install a lock you decorated with scrollwork because you couldn't help making something functional into something beautiful. The world seemed to narrow to just this, Clara's face in the firelight, her words hanging in the air between them, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it over the storm's roar. She'd said it. Not directly, not quite, but clearly enough. She loved him, or was falling into love with him, and the truth of it was there in her eyes, undeniable and terrifying and wonderful. Clara, His voice cracked, and he had to start again. I don't have pretty words like Whitman. I don't know how to say things the way they deserve to be said, but I need you to know. He took her face in his hands, gentle despite the calluses, despite the trembling in his fingers. I need you to know that you've become necessary to me. that the thought of life without you is unbearable, that when I imagine the future, a real future, not just the next day or week, but years ahead, you're in it, you're central to it, and I think, he swallowed hard, I think that's love. I think I love you. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, catching the firelight like jewels. You think, or you know? I know, God help me, Clara, I know. I love you. She kissed him then, deep and desperate, pouring everything she felt into the connection of mouths and the press of bodies. Jonah responded with equal fervor, years of denial and restraint crumbling under the onslaught of emotion. This was what he'd been protecting himself from. Not pain, but this overwhelming rush of feeling, this vulnerability, this surrender to something bigger than fear. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and Jonah realized he was crying too, silent tears tracking down his face, washing away the last remnants of the armor he'd worn for so long. I love you, he said again, because now that he'd said it once, he needed to keep saying it, needed to make up for all the times he'd felt it and swallowed the words. I love you, Clara Monroe, and I don't know how to do this, how to be good at loving someone, but I want to learn. I want to try. That's all I need, Clara whispered. Just you trying. Just you here, with me, choosing this even when it scares you. It terrifies me. Me too. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe alone. Outside, the storm began to break. The wind's howl diminished to a moan, then to a whisper. The snow continued to fall, but with less violence, more like a benediction than an assault. And inside the cabin, by the fire's warmth, Jonah Briggs and Clara Monroe held each other and felt the future shift from possibility to promise. They made love that night, slowly and carefully, learning each other with reverence and wonder. It wasn't the frantic passion of youth or the practiced expertise of experience, but something else entirely. A conversation of bodies, a dialogue of touch, each movement a question and answer about what gave pleasure, what conveyed love, what made the other person feel cherished. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Jonah felt more exposed than he ever had, not physically, but emotionally. Every wall was down, every defense dismantled. Clara could destroy him now with a word, a look, a choice to leave. He'd given her that power completely, and the trust that required was staggering. But she didn't destroy him. She just held him close, her heartbeat steady against his chest, and whispered, I love you, I love you, I love you. Until the words became a rhythm, a lullaby, a promise that maybe, just maybe, trust wasn't the prelude to betrayal but the foundation of everything worth building. The storm ended before dawn on the fourth day. Jonah woke to silence, the absence of wind so complete it seemed loud in its own way. He slipped from bed carefully, not wanting to wake Clara, and went to the window. The world had been transformed. Snow lay in drifts so deep they reached halfway up the cabin walls, covering fences and obscuring roads. The sun was just rising, painting the white landscape in shades of pink and gold, and the beauty of it struck Jonah with physical force. Destruction and creation, chaos and peace, all wrapped up in the same natural phenomenon. It's over, Clara said from behind him, and he turned to find her wrapped in a blanket, her hair mussed from sleep, her expression soft with the newness of what they'd shared. The storm, yes. Everything else is just beginning. She crossed to him and he wrapped his arms around her, both of them looking out at the transformed valley. Somewhere out there, Sage Hollow was digging out, assessing damage, checking on neighbors. Soon they'd need to do the same, venture out, reconnect with the world, face whatever consequences came from Clara having stayed with him through the storm. But for now, in this moment of quiet after chaos, they were just two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd chosen love over fear, who'd weathered the storm together and emerged not just intact, but stronger. What happens now? Clara asked. Now we figure out what comes next, together. Together, she echoed, and it sounded like a vow. The sun climbed higher, melting the surface of the snow into diamonds of light, and Jonah felt something he'd thought lost forever settle into his bones. Hope.
Not the fragile, fearful kind, but the robust variety that could withstand storms, both literal and metaphorical. He'd spent 5 years building walls, choosing isolation over risk, convincing himself that safety was the same as survival. But Clara had shown him different. She'd shown him that real survival meant connection, that true safety came from trust, that the only way to fully live was to be fully vulnerable. It was terrifying. It would continue to be terrifying, probably for the rest of his life. But standing there with Clara in his arms, watching the storm-washed world wake to a new day, Jonah Briggs decided that terror was a price worth paying for love. And for the first time in 5 long years, he was genuinely, completely, terrifyingly happy. The work of digging out began as soon as the sun was high enough to see by. Jonah bundled himself against the cold that came after the storm, a crystalline, bone-deep chill that made the blizzard's fury seem almost warm by comparison, and started clearing a path from the cabin door. Clara insisted on helping despite his protests, wielding a shovel with determined if inexpert strokes. "You're going to hurt yourself," Jonah said, watching her technique with the critical eye of someone who'd spent winters doing this exact work. "Then show me the right way instead of just criticizing." He did, moving behind her to adjust her grip, demonstrating the efficient scoop and toss motion that saved your back over hours of labor. The closeness of it, the casual intimacy of his hands guiding hers, felt both natural and miraculous. 4 days ago, this would have made him self-conscious. Now, it just felt right. They worked in tandem, carving a narrow canyon through snow that came up to Jonah's chest in places. The world was muffled and strange, familiar landmarks buried or transformed. Smoke rose from chimneys in town, evidence that others had survived, were beginning the same work of reclamation and recovery. By mid-morning, they'd cleared enough of a path that Jonah could check on his horse and the livestock. The animals had weathered the storm well enough, hungry and restless but alive. He fed them, broke ice from the water trough, and made mental notes about repairs that would need doing once the snow melted enough to properly assess damage. When he returned to the cabin, he found Clara had made breakfast, eggs and bacon from his stores, coffee so strong it could strip paint. They ate standing up, too tired to bother with chairs, and the simple domesticity of it struck Jonah with unexpected force. This was what a shared life looked like, working together, supporting each other, finding small comforts in the midst of hardship. "I should check on the schoolhouse," Clara said, scraping the last of her eggs onto toast. "Make sure the heating system held up, that nothing got damaged." "We'll go together. But Clara—" He paused, setting down his coffee. "People will have noticed you weren't at the dress shop during the storm. They'll know you were here." "I know. There will be talk, assumptions. Probably some folks who'll think the worst, who'll judge you for it." Clara met his eyes steadily. "Let them judge. I'm not ashamed of staying here, of being with you. Are you ashamed of me being here?" "God, no, never. I just don't want this to hurt you, your reputation, your position at the school." "My reputation can survive some scandal, and if the school board has a problem with it, they can take it up with me directly. I made a choice, Jonah. A choice to be safe, to be with you, and I'd make it again. What other people think about that is their concern, not mine." The fierce independence in her voice, the refusal to apologize or hide, made something swell in Jonah's chest. This was who Clara was, uncompromising in her authenticity, unwilling to shrink herself to fit others' expectations. It was what had drawn him to her from the start, and it was what would probably keep drawing him for the rest of his life. "All right then," he said. "Let's go face the music together." They set out for town, bundled like Arctic explorers, the path Jonah had cleared already starting to drift closed in places where the wind caught it. The walk that normally took 15 minutes stretched to nearly an hour as they navigated drifts and helped each other over obstacles the storm had created. Other folks were out too, the whole town engaged in the monumental task of digging itself free. Timothy Crane was the first to see them, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Jonah and Clara emerging from the direction of Jonah's cabin together. His gaze sharpened with speculation, and Jonah could practically see the gossip forming in the old man's mind. "Brig," Timothy called out, his tone carefully neutral. "Miss Monroe?" Glad to see you both made it through all right. Mr. Crane? Clara responded with equal neutrality. How did your place fare? Lost some shingles, got a drift that'll take me a week to move, but can't complain. Could have been worse. His eyes flicked between them, questions he was too polite or too calculating to ask directly. You weather the storm at the Henley place, Miss Monroe? No, Clara said, her chin lifting slightly in a gesture Jonah recognized as defensive pride. I stayed at Mr. Briggs's cabin. He was kind enough to offer shelter when it became clear the storm would be severe. The information hung in the cold air like a confession, though Clara's tone suggested she saw nothing to confess. Timothy's eyebrows climbed toward his hat, and Jonah could see him recalibrating everything he thought he knew about Jonah Briggs and Clara Monroe. Well, Timothy said slowly, that was neighborly of him. It was practical, Clara corrected, and I'm grateful for it. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to check on the schoolhouse. She walked on, leaving Jonah to nod at Timothy and follow. He could feel the old man's stare boring into his back, could imagine the conversation Timothy would have with his cronies before the day was out. But Clara had been right. This was their business, their choice, and they owed no one explanations beyond what they chose to give. The schoolhouse had survived intact, though snow had drifted against the door so high they had to dig for 20 minutes just to get it open. Inside, the heating system Jonah had installed was cold but undamaged, and Clara moved through the space with visible relief, checking her supplies, her books, the children's work she'd left on her desk. Everything's fine, she said, more to herself than to him. We can reopen tomorrow if the children can make it through the snow. Give it a few days. Let the town dig out properly. Let parents make sure their own situations are stable. The children will still be here next week. Clara nodded, running her hand over her desk with the fond touch of someone greeting an old friend. This place matters so much to me. These children, this work, it's who I am in a lot of ways. I know. That's part of why He trailed off, not sure how to articulate what he wanted to say. Why you what? Why I love you, because you care so deeply about things that matter, because you've built a life around purpose instead of just survival. Because you know who you are and you don't apologize for it. Clara crossed to him, standing close in the cold schoolhouse. I love you too. And Jonah, I'm not going anywhere. Not from this town, not from you, not from this life we're starting to build. You need to hear that, need to believe it, because I can see the doubt in your eyes sometimes. The fear that this is temporary. Old habits. Then we'll build new ones. Habits of trust, of believing in permanence, of knowing that what we have isn't fragile just because it's precious. Before Jonah could respond, the schoolhouse door banged open, admitting a gust of frigid air and Harold Peterson, red-faced and puffing from exertion. Miss Monroe, thank God you're all right. We were worried when you weren't at the dress shop, thought maybe you'd been caught out in the storm, or... He stopped, noticing Jonah, and his expression shifted from relief to understanding to something more complex. Briggs, didn't expect to find you here. I walked Miss Monroe over to check on the school, Jonah said evenly. Make sure everything survived the storm. Right. Of course. Harold's discomfort was palpable, and Jonah could see him struggling with whether to acknowledge the obvious, that Clara and Jonah had clearly spent the storm together, or politely ignore it. Politeness won, barely. Well, everything looks to be in order. Miss Monroe, the town council, will want to meet soon, assess damage, figure out what needs doing. Probably tomorrow afternoon if we can get the hall cleared out. I'll be there, Clara said. Harold nodded and left, but not before casting one more speculative glance at the two of them. Jonah waited until the door closed before letting out a long breath. It's going to be like this all day, isn't it? People seeing us together, making assumptions, trying to figure out what happened without asking directly? Probably, Clara agreed. Does that bother you? It should. A month ago it would have. But now, he shook his head, almost laughing at the absurdity of his own transformation. Now I just don't care. Let them wonder. Let them talk. We know the truth, and that's enough. The truth being? That I love you, that we're together, that whatever comes next we'll face it as partners. He took her hand, threading their fingers together.
that I'm done hiding from life because I'm afraid of being hurt. You've taught me that the risk is worth it. Clara's smile was radiant despite the cold, despite the challenges they both knew were coming. Then let's go show this town exactly who we are, together, unashamed, and ready for whatever they throw at us. They spent the rest of the day helping with the dig-out, working alongside neighbors to clear streets and check on the elderly and infirm. The speculation followed them everywhere. Hushed conversations that stopped when they approached, knowing glances, the occasional bold question about where Clara had weathered the storm. Each time she answered honestly and without elaboration, and each time Jonah stood beside her, silently supporting her choice not to apologize or explain beyond the basic facts. By evening, exhausted and half frozen, they found themselves at the general store where Henry Morrison was taking stock of his inventory and calculating what he'd need to order to replenish storm-depleted supplies. "Briggs, Miss Monroe," Henry greeted them with studied casualness that fooled no one. "What can I get for you?" "Flour, sugar, coffee," Jonah listed, "and whatever Miss Monroe needs for her own supplies." The phrasing was deliberate, acknowledging that Clara had her own household, her own needs, even as it was becoming increasingly clear that those households were merging. Henry noted it with a slight raise of his eyebrows, but made no comment, just began gathering the requested items. Margaret Wilson was there too, along with Sarah Beth Porter and Dolores from the saloon, an unlikely trio united by curiosity and the need for supplies. They made a show of shopping, but Jonah could feel their attention fixed on him and Clara like compass needles finding north. It was Margaret who finally broke, her need to know overwhelming her sense of propriety. "Miss Monroe," she said, approaching with the determined air of someone who'd screwed up her courage, "I hope you don't think it's too forward of me to ask, but, well, we were all worried during the storm. Mrs. Henley said you never came back to your room, and with the weather being what it was..." She trailed off meaningfully. Clara turned to face her directly, and Jonah recognized the set of her shoulders. She was preparing for battle, or at least for honest confrontation. "I stayed at Mr. Briggs's cabin," Clara said clearly, her voice carrying in the quiet store. "He offered me shelter when it became clear the storm would be dangerous, and I accepted. It was the practical choice, and I don't regret it." "I see." Margaret's tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of confirmed speculation. "And Mr. Briggs was hospitable, I trust." "He was everything a gentleman should be," Clara replied, which was both true and misleading and exactly the kind of answer that would fuel rather than quell gossip. "I was safe, warm, and well cared for, more than I would have been alone in my room." Sarah Beth leaned in, unable to contain herself. "But surely you understand how it looks, Miss Monroe. A single woman spending days in a bachelor's cabin. People will talk." "People are already talking," Clara said with a shrug. "And they're welcome to their opinions. But my choices are my own, and I answer only to myself and my conscience, both of which are perfectly clear on this matter." Dolores, who'd been watching with the amused detachment of someone who'd heard every kind of scandal there was, finally spoke up. "Seems to me the only people who need to worry about what happened in that cabin are the two people who were there. Rest of us should mind our own business." "Easy for you to say," Margaret sniffed. "You don't have a reputation to maintain." "No, I've got something better. The good sense not to judge others for doing exactly what I'd do in their position. Storm like that, you take shelter where you can find it. If that shelter comes with a handsome blacksmith attached, well, that's just good fortune." Dolores winked at Clara. "You did all right for yourself, honey. Don't let these hens make you feel otherwise." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut, and Jonah felt the moment stretching toward some kind of confrontation or resolution. Before he could decide how to intervene, Clara made the choice for both of them. She took his hand, right there in front of everyone, and looked around at the assembled women with perfect composure. "Mr. Briggs and I are courting," she announced, using the old-fashioned term deliberately. "Have been for some time now. The storm didn't change that. It just made us more certain of what we already knew. We care for each other, we're building something together, and yes, I spent the storm at his cabin because that's where I wanted to be. With him. Safe, warm, and exactly where I belonged." The declaration landed like a stone in still water, ripples of shock spreading through the store. Jonah felt his heart hammering, not from fear, but from fierce pride in this woman who refused to be cowed,
who claimed their relationship publicly and without shame. "Well," Henry said from behind the counter, breaking the silence, "I think congratulations are in order. Always good to see two people find each other, especially out here where life can be hard and lonely." And it was a lifeline, an offer of normalcy and acceptance, and Jonah grabbed it gratefully. "Thank you, Henry. We appreciate that." Margaret looked like she'd swallowed something sour, but even she couldn't argue with a straightforward courtship announcement. Sarah Beth seemed deflated, her hopes, whatever they'd been, clearly dashed. But Dolores was grinning openly, clearly delighted by the whole scene. "About damn time, Briggs," Dolores said. "Thought you were going to die alone in that forge, all noble solitude and whatnot. Glad to see you came to your senses." Despite everything, Jonah found himself smiling. "Me too." They completed their purchases and left, stepping out into the cold evening with the weight of public declaration settling over them. It was done now. No more speculation, no more wondering. Sage Hollow knew that Jonah Briggs and Clara Monroe were together, and whatever consequences came from that, they'd face them united.
That was brave, Jonah said as they walked toward Clara's room above the dress shop, where she'd need to collect some things and assess any damage from the storm.
"What you did in there? It was necessary. The whispers and speculation would have been worse than the truth. Better to control the narrative, to make it clear that we're together by choice, with intention, and that we're not ashamed of it."
"Are you sure about this? About us being public, being official? It's not too late to walk it back, to say you misspoke, or—" Clara stopped walking, turning to face him in the twilight. "Jonah Briggs, I just announced to half the town that we're courting. I held your hand in front of women who've been trying to catch your attention for years. I made it absolutely clear that I spent 3 days in your cabin and would do it again without hesitation. Does any of that sound like someone who wants to walk anything back?" "No, but nothing. I love you. I want to be with you.
And I'm not going to hide that or minimize it, or apologize for it to make other people comfortable. If the school board has a problem with it, they can fire me. If the town wants to clutch their pearls, let them. I've lived my whole adult life on my own terms, and I'm not stopping now." The fierce certainty in her voice, the absolute refusal to compromise herself, struck Jonah with renewed force. This was who Clara was at her core, unshakable in her convictions, unwilling to diminish herself for acceptance. And she'd chosen him. Somehow, impossibly, she'd looked at his scars and his fears and his 5 years of bitter isolation and decided he was worth fighting for. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway." She smiled, taking his hand again. "Come on, help me check my room and then we'll figure out what comes next." Clara's room above the dress shop had survived the storm without incident, though it was cold as a tomb and would need a fire going for hours before it was truly habitable again. They built one in the small stove, Clara gathering her teaching materials and personal items while Jonah made sure the windows were secure and the roof hadn't leaked. "I can't stay here tonight," Clara said, looking around the cold space with practical assessment. "Even with the fire, it'll be hours before it's warm enough. Stay with me again. At the cabin." "Jonah, we just made a public declaration. If I stay with you again so soon, people will really talk." "Let them. You said it yourself. We're not hiding, not apologizing. If you need a warm place to sleep and I have one to offer, why shouldn't you take it? We're courting. We're committed to each other. Staying under the same roof isn't scandalous, it's practical." Clara studied him with that penetrating gaze that always made him feel transparent. "You've really changed, haven't you? The man I met 2 months ago would never have suggested this. The man you met 2 months ago was half dead and didn't know it. You changed that, changed me. And I'm tired of living in fear of what people think, of what might go wrong. I'd rather live boldly with you than safely alone." "Bold doesn't quite suit you yet. You wear it like a new coat, still a bit stiff, not quite broken in." "Then help me break it in. Stay with me, not just tonight, but stay with me, Clara. Move into the cabin. Make it our home instead of just mine." The proposal hung in the air between them, more significant than it might have seemed. This wasn't just about convenience or warmth. It was about commitment, about building a life together openly and intentionally. It was about Jonah finally, fully stepping into the future instead of remaining anchored to the past. Clara's eyes were bright with emotion, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with it. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once I move in,
Once we're living together, there's no going back.
The town will expect marriage, will pressure us toward it, and good. Let them expect it. Let them pressure us. Because that's where this is heading anyway, isn't it? You and me building a life together, making it official in every way that matters. Are you proposing, Jonah Briggs? He hadn't been, not exactly, but the words had brought him right to the edge of it. And standing there in Clara's cold room with her looking at him like he hung the moon, Jonah realized he didn't want to wait. Didn't want to be cautious or gradual or sensible. He wanted Clara, wanted a future with her, wanted to stop hedging his bets and just commit fully to the best thing that had ever happened to him. Not yet, he said, and saw her face fall slightly before he continued. Not yet, because when I propose, I want to do it right. With a ring, with planning, with all the romance and ceremony you deserve. But Clara, make no mistake, I'm going to propose. Soon. And when I do, I need you to know it's not because the town expects it or because we're living together and it's the proper thing. It'll be because I can't imagine my life without you in it, because you've become essential to me, because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Tears streaked down Clara's face, but she was smiling through them, radiant and beautiful in his. Then yes. Yes, I'll move into the cabin. Yes, I'll build a life with you. And yes, when you propose properly with rings and romance, I'll say yes to that too. Jonah crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest while she cried happy tears into his shirt. This was it. The moment when his old life truly ended and his new one began. The moment when Jonah Briggs, the man who'd refused every woman in town, who'd chosen loneliness over risk for 5 long years, finally embraced the terrifying, exhilarating reality of love. They stayed in Clara's room only long enough to pack what she'd need immediately, planning to come back for the rest over the coming days. As they prepared to leave, Clara paused at the door, looking back at the small space that had been her home for the past 2 months. Nervous? Jonah asked. A little. This feels like a big step, even though it's the logical next one. We can wait if you need more time. I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for. Clara shook her head. I'm ready. I've been ready since you installed that lock on the schoolhouse, and I realized you were the kind of man who adds beauty to function because he can't help himself. I'm just taking a moment to appreciate the significance of it, the before and after. And I'm excited about the after. About our after. She closed the door firmly behind them, literally and figuratively, closing the chapter of her life that didn't include Jonah at the center of it. Let's go home. Home. The word settled into Jonah's chest like a warm stone, and he took Clara's hand as they descended the stairs and stepped out into the cold evening. The walk back to the cabin felt different now. Not like he was escorting her somewhere temporary, but like they were going home together. Like they belonged to each other and to the life they were building. The town would talk, certainly. There would be judgment and speculation, and probably some genuine scandal among the more conservative residents. But there would also be support, acceptance, even celebration from those who'd watched Jonah's isolation with concern and were glad to see him finally living again. As they walked through the snow-covered streets, they passed others engaged in their own evening routines. Families gathering for dinner, neighbors helping each other with storm repairs, the ordinary business of life continuing despite nature's recent fury. Some called out greetings, others just nodded, and a few stared openly at the sight of Jonah and Clara walking hand in hand toward his cabin. Let them stare, Jonah thought. Let them talk. He had Clara, had love, had a future that looked nothing like the barren landscape he'd resigned himself to. That was worth any amount of gossip or speculation. The cabin welcomed them with warmth from the fire Jonah had banked that morning. Clara moved through the space with new ownership, not like a guest, but like someone who belonged there. She put her things in the bedroom, their bedroom now, and started preparing dinner while Jonah tended the fire and the evening chores. It was domestic and ordinary and absolutely perfect. They ate together at the small table, talking about practical matters, where Clara's books would go, how they'd arrange the space to accommodate 2 lives instead of 1 when they'd retrieve the rest of her belongings. But underneath the practical was something deeper, a current of joy and anticipation about what they were building. After dinner, they sat by the fire, as had become their habit, But tonight, Clara pulled Jonah's arms around her and settled back against his chest with a contented sigh. "This is what I imagined," she said quietly. "When I was in Kansas, in Wyoming, teaching in schools and living in rented rooms, I'd imagined this: a home, a partner, a life built on something real. But I'd almost given up on it, thought maybe I was too independent, too difficult, too unwilling to compromise the parts of myself that mattered. You don't have to compromise those parts, not with me. I know. That's what makes this so extraordinary. You don't want me to be smaller or quieter or more conventional. You love me as I am, stubborn, opinionated, occasionally difficult." "Always difficult," Jonah corrected with a smile. "But that's part of why I love you. You push me, challenge me, refuse to let me hide in my comfortable misery." Was it comfortable? The misery? In its way. Predictable, at least, safe. But God, Clara, it was so empty. I didn't realize how empty until you filled it with light and noise and feeling. I thought I was living, but I was just existing. You taught me the difference." Clara turned in his arms to face him, her expression serious. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if the fear comes back, when the fear comes back, because it will, you'll talk to me about it instead of pulling away. That you won't let Rebecca's ghost drive a wedge between us because you're waiting for me to betray you the way she did. I promise. It won't be easy. Those patterns are worn deep, and I'll probably backslide sometimes, assume the worst when I should trust the best. But I promise to try, to fight it, to choose you and us over fear. That's all I can ask." They kissed in the firelight, slow and deep, and Jonah marveled at how natural it felt, how right. This was what he'd been missing, what he'd denied himself for so long. Not just physical connection, but emotional intimacy, the vulnerability of being truly known and loved anyway. When they finally went to bed, it was with the easy comfort of people who belong together. They made love again, but differently than the night before, with less urgency, more playfulness, the joy of discovery mixed with growing familiarity. And afterward, lying tangled in the sheets with Clara's head on his shoulder, Jonah felt a peace so profound it was almost frightening. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "That I'm happy, genuinely, terrifyingly happy, and that I keep waiting for something to ruin it, for the other shoe to drop. What if there is no other shoe? What if this is just it, the good thing you get to keep? Can it really be that simple? Why not? Why does happiness have to be complicated or temporary? Why can't we just have this, each other, a home, a life, and let that be enough?" Jonah thought about it, really thought about it. His whole adult life had been defined by waiting for disaster, by the certainty that good things were preludes to pain. Rebecca had reinforced that belief, but she hadn't created it. Somewhere along the way, probably when he'd lost his parents young and learned that nothing was permanent, Jonah had decided that hope was dangerous and trust was foolish. But what if Clara was right? What if happiness didn't have to be earned or defended or anticipated as temporary? What if he could just accept it, live in it, let it be real without constantly bracing for its loss? "I want to believe that," he said finally. "I want to believe we get to keep this." Then believe it, choose to believe it every day until belief becomes truth. It sounded simple when she said it, though Jonah knew the execution would be harder. But he was willing to try. For Clara, for himself, for the future they were building, he was willing to do the hard work of learning to trust in good things. "All right," he whispered into the darkness. "I'll believe. We get to keep this. You and me, together, building something that lasts." "We get to keep this," Clara echoed, and in her voice Jonah heard the same determination he felt, the refusal to let fear or doubt or past pain steal what they'd found. They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other, two people who'd both known loneliness, choosing connection instead. And if Jonah's dreams were peaceful for the first time in years, if he slept without the nightmares of abandonment and betrayal that had plagued him since Rebecca, well, that was just more evidence that Clara was right. They got to keep this, and Jonah was finally fully ready to believe it. The next morning brought the town council meeting, and Clara insisted they attend together. Jonah would have preferred to avoid it. Council meetings were generally tedious affairs, and his presence would only fuel more speculation. But Clara was adamant. We're part of this community, she said firmly, and we need to be present for the decisions that affect it. Besides, I want them to see us together, to normalize it. The more we act like this is perfectly natural and unremarkable, the sooner it will become exactly that. So they went, walking into the church hall where the meeting was being held with their heads high and their hands linked. The reaction was immediate. Conversations paused, heads turned, and Jonah could feel the weight of collective attention settle on them like a physical thing. Reverend Hutchins called the meeting to order with a pointed clearing of his throat, and people reluctantly turned their attention from Jonah and Clara to the business at hand. The discussion centered on storm damage, which roads needed clearing first, which buildings required immediate repair, how to help families who'd lost livestock or suffered significant property damage. Jonah contributed when asked about metalwork needs, and Clara spoke up about the school's readiness to reopen. They were professional, focused, giving no one ammunition for criticism. But Jonah was aware of Margaret Wilson's pursed lips, of Sarah Beth's wounded glances, of the careful neutrality with which most people address Clara now. It was Harold Peterson who finally addressed the elephant in the room, though not directly. "Miss Monroe," he said during a lull in the discussion, "there's been some concern about the propriety of certain situations arising from the storm. The school board wants to ensure that our teacher maintains the standards of behavior expected of someone in a position of influence over children." The room went silent. Everyone suddenly fascinated by the floor or the ceiling or anything other than the confrontation brewing. Clara's hand tightened on Jonah's, but her voice was steady when she responded. "What specific concerns does the board have, Mr. Peterson? I'd appreciate directness rather than vague implications." Harold shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing someone else had taken this task. "Well, it's been noted that you spent the storm at Mr. Briggs' cabin, unchaperoned, for several days, and while I'm sure it was all perfectly innocent, the appearance of impropriety is less important than my actual conduct," Clara finished, "which has been beyond reproach. I sought shelter during a dangerous storm, which was the prudent and sensible thing to do. What the town chooses to make of that says more about them than about me. Be that as it may, there are standards that I meet and exceed in every way that matters. I'm an excellent teacher, my students are thriving, and my personal life, provided it doesn't interfere with my professional duties, is exactly that, personal." Claire's voice took on an edge. "Now, if the board wishes to terminate my contract based on moral objections to my choices, they're welcome to try, but they should know I'll fight it, and they should also consider how difficult it will be to find a replacement mid-year, in the middle of winter, in a town that apparently judges its teachers more harshly than their actual performance. It was a calculated risk, playing hardball with people who held her employment in their hands." But Jonah recognized the strategy. Clara was forcing them to acknowledge that their moral outrage was less important than practical necessity. She was too good at her job, too valuable to the community, to be easily dismissed over something as nebulous as propriety. Reverend Hutchins, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "I think what Harold is trying to say, albeit clumsily, is that we want to ensure Miss Monroe's reputation, and by extension the school's reputation, remains intact. Perhaps if there were official intentions, an engagement perhaps that would contextualize the situation in a more acceptable light?" Jonah felt Clara tense beside him, and he knew what she was thinking. They were being pressured into making their relationship public in a specific way, being pushed toward an announcement they weren't quite ready for. The proposal he'd promised was supposed to be on their terms, in their time, not forced by town council politics. But looking around the room, seeing the expectant faces and the barely concealed judgment, Jonah made a decision. He stood, bringing Clara up with him, and addressed the room with a clarity that surprised even himself. "Clara and I are courting," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Have been for weeks now. Our intention is to marry, though the timing is our business and no one else's. What happened during the storm, her staying at my cabin, was a practical decision that likely saved her life, given the severity of the weather. And yes, it also reflected the trust and commitment we've built together. But we've conducted ourselves with honor, with respect for each other, and for this community, and I'll be damned if I stand here and let anyone suggest otherwise." The room erupted in murmurs, shock, approval, disapproval, all mixed together in a chaotic buzz. Clara was looking at him with something like awe, and Jonah realized he'd just done something the old him never could have, publicly defended their relationship, claimed it proudly, and challenged anyone who had a problem with it. "Well," Reverend Hutchins said when the noise died down, "I think that clarifies the situation admirably. An engagement is as good as official intentions, and I'm sure we all wish Mr. Briggs and Miss Monroe every happiness." The words were pointedly directed at Harold and the others who'd raised concerns, a clear signal that the matter was settled. Harold nodded reluctantly, and the meeting moved on to other business. But the victory felt hollow to Jonah. They'd won the battle. Clara's position was secure, their relationship was acknowledged, but at the cost of some of their autonomy. The proposal had been announced before it was made, the engagement declared before they'd fully decided on it. After the meeting, as they walked home through the cold afternoon, Clara was quiet. Jonah couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she was angry or grateful or something else entirely. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for announcing an engagement before I'd actually proposed, for taking that moment from us." Clara stopped walking, turning to face him. "Are you sorry for defending me? For standing up to them and making it clear that you're proud to be with me?" "No, never that." "Then don't apologize. Yes, it would have been nice to have that moment be ours alone. But Jonah, what you did in there, standing up for us, for me, in front of everyone, that mattered more than timing or perfect proposals. You showed me, and everyone else, that you're all in, that you're not ashamed or uncertain or hedging your bets. I'm not. I love you, Clara, and I want to marry you, want to build a life with you. That's not about town pressure or appearances. It's about knowing you're it for me. You're the future I want." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Then ask me, right here, right now, in the middle of this snowy street. Ask me properly." Jonah's heart hammered. This wasn't how he'd planned it. No ring, no romantic setting, just the two of them in the cold with the whole town probably watching from windows. But it was honest, it was real, and it was theirs. He took both her hands in his, looking into her eyes with all the love and certainty he felt. "Clara Monroe, you walked into my life and refused to let me hide. You saw past my walls and my fears and my stubborn determination to stay alone. And you loved me anyway. You've made me want things I thought I'd never want again. A partner, a future, a family. You've made me believe in good things, in lasting things, in the possibility that happiness isn't just the prelude to pain. I don't have a ring yet. I don't have perfect words. But I have this. I love you. I choose you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice in fighting for us. Will you marry me?" Clara was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Yes. Yes, Jonah, I'll marry you. I'll spend the rest of my life with you, building something beautiful together." He kissed her then, in the middle of Main Street with half of Sage Hollow probably watching, and it was perfect. Imperfect and public and nothing like he'd imagined, but perfect because it was theirs, because it was real. Because it was the moment when Jonah Briggs finally stopped running from love and embraced it fully. When they broke apart, breathless and grinning, Jonah saw curtains twitching in windows, saw faces quickly disappearing from doorways. By tomorrow, the whole town would know every detail of this proposal, but he found he didn't care. Let them know. Let them see that the man who'd refused every woman in town had found the one worth saying yes to. "Come on," Clara said, taking his hand. "Let's go home. I want to start planning our life together." "Our life together," Jonah repeated, and the words felt like a promise, like a vow, like the beginning of everything he'd been too afraid to hope for. They walked home through the snow, engaged and happy and ready for whatever came next. And if Jonah glanced back once at the town that had witnessed their proposal, it was only to acknowledge that this place, these people, were part of their story now, woven into the fabric of their future. He'd spent 5 years as Sage Hollow's most famous recluse, the man who chose loneliness over risk. But now he was something else entirely. A man in love. A man engaged. A man building a future with the woman who'd refused to let him settle for just surviving when he could be living. And that, Jonah thought as he squeezed Clara's hand and felt her squeeze back, was worth every moment of fear it had taken to get here. The weeks that followed the proposal passed in a blur of preparation and transformation. Spring was still months away, but inside Jonah's cabin, their cabin now, a different kind of thaw was taking place. The space that had been designed for solitude was being reimagined for partnership, and with each change, Jonah felt the last remnants of his old life falling away like snow from a roof in the sun. Clara's books found homes on shelves Jonah built specifically for them. Her teaching materials claimed a corner of the main room where she could work in the evenings, and her clothes hung beside his on pegs he'd installed with careful spacing. It was domestic and ordinary and utterly revolutionary for a man who'd spent 5 years keeping everything and everyone at a distance. The ring came first, though. 3 days after the proposal, Jonah presented Clara with a band he'd forged himself. Gold that he'd traded favors to acquire, worked and shaped with more care than he'd ever given any commission. The design was simple but elegant, a smooth band with subtle scrollwork that echoed the decorative elements he couldn't help adding to his work. Inside, he'd engraved their initials and the date of the proposal. Clara had cried when he slipped it onto her finger, and those tears had undone something in Jonah's chest, some final knot of doubt that whispered he wasn't enough, could never be enough. Because she was crying not from disappointment or obligation, but from pure joy, from love. "It's perfect," she'd whispered, turning her hand to catch the firelight and the gold. "Jonah, it's absolutely perfect. It's plain. I could have made something more elaborate with stones or... It's perfect because you made it, because it's from your hands, your heart, your craft. I wouldn't change a single thing about it." Now, 2 weeks later, Clara wore that ring constantly, absently turning it on her finger when she was thinking, touching it like a talisman when she needed reassurance. Jonah found himself watching for those moments, finding deep satisfaction in the visible proof that she'd chosen him, that she was his as much as he was hers. The school had reopened and Clara returned to teaching with renewed energy. The children noticed the ring immediately, their questions coming in a barrage of curiosity and excitement. "Are you getting married, Miss Monroe?" little Sarah Yates asked, eyes wide. "I am," Clara confirmed, smiling. "To Mr. Briggs, the blacksmith?" Tommy Henderson sounded skeptical, as if he couldn't quite imagine his teacher with the stern, quiet man who shoed horses and made gates. "Yes, to Mr. Briggs." "Does that mean you're going to leave us?" The fear in Sarah's voice was real, and Clara had knelt down to look the girl in the eyes. "No, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be your teacher, still be here every day. The only thing that's changing is that I'll be Mrs. Briggs instead of Miss Monroe, and I'll go home to a cabin instead of a room above the dress shop. But this," she gestured around the schoolhouse, "this stays the same." The relief on the children's faces had been palpable, and Clara had returned home that evening to tell Jonah about it, her voice thick with emotion. "They were afraid I'd leave them," she said, curled against him by the fire. "Like every other good thing in their lives. Temporary, unreliable. I wanted to promise them I'd stay forever, but I couldn't. What if the school board decides they don't want a married teacher? What if—" "Then we'll figure it out," Jonah interrupted gently. "Whatever comes, we'll handle it together. But Clara, those children love you. This town needs you. They're not going to let you go without a fight, and neither am I." She'd kissed him then, deep and grateful, and they'd spent the rest of the evening planning their wedding, a simple ceremony in the church, a gathering afterward for the whole town, nothing elaborate but everything meaningful. The date was set for early April, when the worst of winter would be past, but before the spring planting demanded everyone's attention. It gave them 2 months to prepare, 2 months to solidify their partnership before making it official in the eyes of God and community. But those 2 months also brought challenges neither of them had fully anticipated. The first came in the form of a letter, delivered by the mail coach on a gray February morning. Claire was at school when it arrived, so Jonah accepted it from the courier and set it aside, noting the unfamiliar handwriting and the Kansas postmark with mild curiosity. When Claire returned that evening, she saw the letter immediately, and her face went pale. "It's from my father," she said, her voice hollow. "I'd recognize his handwriting anywhere." Jonah handed it to her, watching concern as she stared at the envelope like it might bite. "Do you want me to leave while you read it? Give you privacy?" No, stay. I might need you. She opened it with trembling fingers, unfolding the single sheet of paper covered in her father's cramped script. Jonah watched her face as she read, seeing emotions chase across it. Surprise, pain, anger, something that might have been hope. When she finished, she handed him the letter without a word. Jonah read it carefully, his jaw tightening with each line. The letter was brief and cold, written in the formal language of a man who didn't know how to express feeling, even if he'd wanted to. Clara's father had heard, through channels he didn't specify, about her engagement. He wrote that he hoped she'd come to her senses and was marrying a man of substance and character rather than wasting her life on the foolish independence she'd chosen. He expected to be informed of the wedding details so he could fulfill his duty of giving her away, though the phrasing made it clear he considered this obligation rather than joy. There was no apology for their estrangement, no acknowledgement of the pain his rejection had caused, no expression of love or pride in the woman his daughter had become. Just duty, obligation, and the faint suggestion that marriage might redeem her in his eyes. Jonah set the letter down, fury building in his chest. He has no right. After years of silence, of judgment, he thinks he can just show up and play the dutiful father? It's what I expected, Clara said quietly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. He doesn't apologize, doesn't change. He just adjusts reality to fit what he can accept. I'm not his educated, independent daughter who chose teaching over marriage. I'm his wayward daughter who finally saw reason and found a husband. You don't have to respond. You don't owe him anything, Clara. Not explanation, not reconciliation, and certainly not a place at our wedding. Don't I? She looked at him, and the pain in her eyes cut him deep. He's my father, Jonah. The only family I have. And yes, he hurt me, disappointed me, rejected the choices that made me who I am. But he's still my father, and part of me, her voice broke, part of me wants him there, wants him to see that I made a good choice, that my life is full and meaningful and happy, wants him to admit, even if only to himself, that he was wrong about me. Jonah pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried out years of accumulated hurt and longing. He understood that particular pain, the desire for parental approval even from beyond the grave, the need to prove yourself to someone who should have believed in you all along. His own parents had given him that unconditional support, and their loss had devastated him precisely because he'd known how rare, how precious that kind of love was. Clara didn't have it, had never had it, and she was still reaching for it, hoping against hope that her father might finally see her worth. "What do you want to do?" Jonah asked when her tears subsided. "I'll support whatever you decide. But Clara, you need to be honest with yourself about what you're hoping for. If you invite him, if he comes, there's a good chance he'll disappoint you again. Can you handle that?" "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe it's worth the risk to give him one more chance, to see if marriage makes me acceptable in his eyes in a way teaching never could." She pulled back to look at Jonah,